Now, generally speaking, it's expected that the first boss in a video game won't offer up too much resistance, but generally speaking, these 10 video game bosses gave that concept the middle finger. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 hardest first bosses in video games. Number 10. Kuze, Yakuza 0. As a prequel to the mainline Yakuza franchise, Yakuza 0 served as an entry point for many new fans and is largely credited with boosting the series' popularity over the last few years. Though the game eases players in gently with reams of cinematics and fuss-free combat, the first boss battle against Tojo Clan Lieutenant Kuze represents a massively challenging skill check. Those new to the series were blindsided en masse by the ferocity of Yakuza 0's first boss, who due to the player's relative weakness and lack of combat abilities at this point, ends up being one of the game's very toughest bosses. He's got a massive life bar, can counter most of what you can throw at him, and if he locks you into a combo attack, you can lose massive amounts of health. To make matters worse, you have to battle your way through fleets of goons before making your way to him. And because the game's checkpointing is, well, let's just call it what it is, god-awful, you're forced to go through it all again if he beats you, and likely he will. It all adds up to a frustrating difficulty spike that caught many players off guard, but also kind of ensured that they knew what to expect moving forward. Number 9. Murai, Ninja Gaiden. While Yakuza 0 is a relatively easy game outside of a few tricky boss fights, Ninja Gaiden is an absolute infuriating ass-kicker from start to finish, and is generally accepted to be one of the most difficult video games of the last 20 years or so. And Team Ninja enthusiastically threw players in at the deep end with the game's first boss fight against Rogue Ninja Murai. This is a boss fight so challenging many players never actually got past it, and only through perseverance and intense determination could anyone continue on. Now, he's a dab hand with nunchucks and will absolutely punish you if you let him. Dodging is absolutely vital to avoid his debilitating attacks, but even then, you'll need to find those brief windows of vulnerability to start chipping away at his health. Though the fight is certainly effective in teaching players that they need to put the graft in to expose an enemy's vulnerabilities, that doesn't make it any less annoying when you've been felled by him for the 15th time in a bloody row. Number 8. Engel's Goliath, Nier Automata, Potato Patata. Nier Automata Potato Patata boasts one of the most head-scratchingly unforgiving video game prologues ever, because above all else you need to beat the 40 or so minute segment without dying due to the lack of checkpoints. Now, were Automata's intro a fairly ho-hum glorified tutorial, that might have been fine, but given that you have to defeat the towering Goliath-class machine Engels before you're able to save, it lurches into arguably excessive, if not downright unreasonable territory. Considering how easily the Engels Goliath can kill you, especially on higher difficulties, this is quite the maddening boss fight indeed. It will test your reflexes and attentiveness, and while absolutely setting you up for the rest of the game, it does rather feel like director Yoko Taro had a bit too much fun at the player's expense here. Unsurprisingly, many players opted ultimately to just cheese their way through the prologue on easy difficulty rather than having to slog through it again and again ad nauseum. Number 7. The Root Pack or Goopy Legrand, Cuphead. Now, Cuphead's first boss can actually be one of 2 encounters, both of which are unlocked right away on Inkwell Isle. While they're surely the 2 easiest bosses in the game, that's really more of a testament to just how damn hard Cuphead can truly be, because these 2 are still mighty challenges by any conventional metric, and the choice comes down to either the Root Pack or Goopy Legrand. The Root Pack is a trio of deranged root vegetables, a potato, onion, and carrot, who will then fire projectiles at you. Now, once you've gotten a few more boss fights under your belt, this one is certainly trivial, but it's still easy for new players acclimating to Cuphead's unconventional gameplay style and aesthetic to get caught unawares. The second option is the incrementally more difficult Goopy Legrand, a big blue ball of slime that will hop around the screen and attempt to both punch and crush you. His 3 phases can certainly throw you off if you're not paying close attention, and if you've not gotten used to the control scheme, Goopy can definitely make short and easy work of you. Number 6. Father Gascoigne, Bloodborne. With Bloodborne's Cleric Beast being an optional encounter, albeit hugely recommended in order to pick up the Sword Hunter badge, the game's first mandatory boss battle is actually against Father Gascoigne. The Father's axe and gun attacks can make short work of you if you're not fast on the move and quick on the draw, especially if this happens to be your first From Software game. Even for the developer's unforgiving standards, he is a tricky boss for an opening fight, and even if you manage to fend off his human form, he'll eventually transform into a wolf-like creature for some added challenge. He moves so quickly and can deal massive amounts of damage if you're not in the zone, as it were, and so for many became quite literally the brick wall preventing them from further progress. Number 5. The Kairon, The Witcher 2 Assassins of Kings. The Witcher 2's first boss is the Kairon, a gigantic water-dwelling tentacled creature which for a first boss poses quite the indecent, even irritating challenge. For starters, its tentacles are capable of killing you with just a few hits, especially on higher difficulties and also if you haven't chugged the Mongoose potion which will protect you from the venomous mucus. Even though the game makes it clear that you need to destroy 4 of the creature's 6 tentacles, it's easier said than done given the speed with which it can hit you or indeed throw rocks at you. The key to victory involves trapping the 4 tentacles with the magic sign Yrden and then hacking away at them, but the sheer chaos of it all makes it decidedly trickier than it looks. Given that some players may have stumbled into the fight underleveled and without any clue of what they're doing, it's little surprise that many were left utterly stumped on this for a good while. Number 4. Vepr, Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Nothing will make you feel more like a scrub fraud than this apparent tutorial boss absolutely wiping the floor with you, as happened to most anyone while playing Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. This is a gigantic, grotesque humanoid sea monster who can quickly annihilate the player with her tentacles and acid/water projectile attacks. You'll likely die a few times in order to figure out her attack patterns, especially as her busy movements will try and divide your attention for most of the battle. Now if you're mad enough to try and tackle this on higher difficulties, well, she becomes a lot trickier. With her increased speed and ferocity, she arguably becomes one of the most frustrating bosses in the entire game. Given that she has an over-the-odds amount of health and you have very little equipment to offer, she presents some major pushback right out of the gate. Number 3. Urizen, Devil May Cry 5. Devil May Cry 5's Urizen is an especially interesting opening boss fight because, in fact, you're not actually supposed to beat him. The battle is designed to be lost because you'll end up encountering him numerous times throughout the games and get a fully fledged fight with him right at the end. As a result, the prologue battle is extremely difficult, and yet the game does allow sufficiently skilled players to overcome and defeat him. This in turn unlocks a secret ending which somewhat sarcastically rolls the end credits very early. Winning the fight is a massive pain though, largely due to the fact that the player hasn't yet been able to kit themselves out with skill and health upgrades. Urizen will hurl all manner of extremely harmful projectiles your way, and the time windows where he's vulnerable to attacks are very, very small. Simply put, only the most hardcore DMC players have a hope in hell of beating him the hard way. Number 2. Derek the Executioner, Nioh. Now don't let his daft name fool you. Derek the Executioner may be a relatively easy boss by Nioh's otherwise hellacious standards, but by any conventional metric he can still be a major pain in the ass for your novice or even averagely skilled player. Derek more or less acts as a test of everything you've been taught throughout the game's tutorial up until this point. Though his slow, lumbering movement and generously telegraphed tells are certainly helpful, your limited arsenal means that you will struggle a lot here. The fight is totally effective in teaching players through failure not to get greedy with their attacks, to favor chipping away while dodging where necessary, but learning that lesson absolutely results in sure frustration for many new to this type of game. And number 1, Frike, Returnal. Returnal's first boss is an interesting example because while you'll surely encounter Frike for the first time within an hour or two of playing, it will be much longer than that before you can take this creature down. As it turns out, Frike is basically the toughest of the game's 5 bosses, unaided by the fact that players are still getting used to the Metroidvania-esque gameplay loop, and the developers reported that Frike caused more player deaths in the game's first month on release than any other boss, though that might be in part because even reaching the other 4 bosses may have taken many players longer than a month. You'll need to take countless runs through this first biome, spanning possibly a few dozen hours before you're ready to kill Frike, whose high damage bullet hell attacks can cut you down with ease. Once you've mastered the game's movement mechanics enough to finally kill Frike, the other bosses, they kind of seem considerably simpler by comparison.
Some video game baddies are renowned for giving players the right amount of challenge. On the flip side, there are those that are cheap and unfair, but there are also certain villains who split gamers right down the middle. And although no one is going to argue how arduous these bosses are, it's hard to say whether the challenge is fair. I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 seriously hard video game bosses that divide fans. Number 10. The Hell House, Final Fantasy VII Remake. The Hell House appeared as a random encounter enemy in the original Final Fantasy VII, but for the remake, the Demented Dwelling was upgraded to a proper boss. But not just any boss, Hell House serves as the last enemy you face in Corneo Coliseum. Because the Sinistar Shack constantly changes its elemental weakness throughout the 4 phases of battle, you need to monitor what it's vulnerable to in order to fill its stagger gauge. Only when Hell House is staggered can your 2-person party do some serious damage. Although Hell House is one tough building on normal mode, many many believe he's the most challenging enemy to face whilst playing on the highest difficulty. However, he's only unfair to the underprepared player. If you bring all 4 elemental materia to the arena and divide them evenly between Cloud and Aerith, this insidious abode is 10 times easier. Still, the fight is a doozy since Hell House constantly rotates its weakness at blinding speed, but if you have your elemental materia ready to unleash at any given moment, you have a decent chance against him. Number 9. The Lord of Doors, Death's Door. In Death's Door's closing moments, you face the Lord of Doors, an entity who's closed the door to his own demise. This guy is a pain since there are 8 phases of the battle. Although you get to save before the last part, the Lord's final assault is unbearable. As a result, you'll want to pummel the supposed immortal at every chance. Since you have to be beside him to deal some damage, you are always vulnerable while on the offensive. Also, the more times you strike the Lord, the more likely he'll hit back. Because of this, you have to gamble how many times you want to wail on the dark entity. Although hitting him once each time sounds like the safe bet, it makes the battle drag on, making it likely you'll succumb to one of the Lord's many attacks over time. But if you hit the pseudo-deity several times at once, you're giving him more time to counter. No matter what you do, it always feels like your fault when you lose. If you died while playing it safe, you're annoyed you didn't seize the moment. If you died while going in guns blazing, you're frustrated you weren't more cautious. Number 8. Dark Link, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. In Ocarina of Time, Link must square off against a shadowy doppelganger while in everyone's favourite level, the Water Temple. Now, since sub-bosses up until this point haven't been much trouble, you assume Dark Link will be a pushover. However, many players believe this insidious clone is the hardest enemy in the game. Because Dark Link mirrors your movements, he cancels out every attack with ease. Japanese players complained about Dark Link so much, Nintendo toned down the malevolent double's difficulty when Ocarina of Time was released in the West. Even though Dark Link pulls no punches, he's totally fair. Firstly, he's the only enemy whose health is level with yours. Whether your health is composed of 3 hearts or 10, your evil stats will have the same amount. Also, he's only tricky if you spam him with the Master Sword. If you use the Megaton Hammer, the Shield, or the Deku Nuts, you'll have more variety in battle. If you have enough magic, you can repeatedly summon Din's Fire, which Dark Link can't block. Despite the fact there are many methods to thwart Dark Link, he's still one of the most hated bosses in the franchise. Number 7. Dr. Karl, Cuphead. For the most part, Cuphead fans' opinions on bosses are unified. We can all agree Grim Matchstick is way too hard, and for a final boss, the Devil is surprisingly easy. King Dice is the longest battle, but it's not too bad once you've memorized his patterns. But if there's one enemy who's divided gamers, it's Dr. Karl. In the first phase of this aerial fight, our hero must blast Karl's automaton while it shoots lasers, homing missiles, bolts, and sparks. When you destroy the robot's body, his head whizzes around the arena attempting to crash into you. Once that's dealt with, you'll face Karl directly while he pilots a hovercraft. The Dr. Wily-inspired scientist emits energy bolts in every direction while electrified walls keep moving towards the player. This is the hardest part of the bout by far, since the screen is littered with obstacles. However, some players have little trouble with Karl for one reason: parries. Although parrying is introduced early in the game, it's not a mechanic everyone masters. If you can't nail this technique, Karl can stop your progress dead. If parrying comes natural to you, you can defeat the mad scientist in 2 minutes flat. Number 6. Karstag, The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. By performing a series of actions in Skyrim, you can awaken Karstag's ghost in Castle Karstag Ruins. Now, if you are expecting some reward for your efforts, you'll have to vanquish the monstrous spirit. However, felling Karstag is easier said than done. This supernatural being is at level 90, boasts 4000 HP, and has a frost cloak which continuously depletes your health bar. If you are hoping to rely on poison and paralysis, they have no effect on him. Also, getting hit by his club and fists hurt a lot. Because Karstag is so barbarically unfair, you may wonder why any player would go against him. Considering your reward is a summon you can use only 3 times, beating this guy sounds like more trouble than it's worth. But some players needed this fight. Although Skyrim is a masterpiece, you can't pretend you weren't disappointed after facing and easily defeating the final boss, Alduin. Because you've been told for 40 plus hours that it's the be-all and end-all, you're expecting a monstrous showdown. Sadly, the confrontation with this so-called ultimate adversary is a total letdown. If you're still sore Alduin didn't provide a challenge, you know where to find Karstag. But don't say you weren't warned. Number 5. Sigrun, God of War. Going into 2018's God of War, fans were pumped to see Kratos unleashing his fury against screen-filling monsters, mythical creatures, and literal deities. However, nobody was ready to wage war against Sigrun, the Valkyrie Queen. Sigrun is the most powerful of the Valkyrie and the most insane, making her fighting pattern incredibly erratic and unpredictable. Not only is she endowed with all the special attacks of her fallen sisters, her telegraphing is minimal, giving Kratos little chance to dodge or counter. If Sigrun was in the main campaign, she would be a major roadblock in your playthrough, but this Norse godling gets a pass since she's an optional boss. Because you have to go out of your way to fight Sigrun, you only have yourself to blame for seeking out this bout. And considering you murdered 8 of her siblings, did you honestly expect the scorned Valkyrie to go easy on you? Also, Sigrun isn't meant to be fair, she's designed to test the most hardcore players. If you feel like you can beat God of War on the highest difficulty with one arm tied behind your back, well, that's impressive first of all, but also Sigrun will swiftly humble you. Number 4. The Xenomorph, Alien Isolation. Although Alien Isolation is an excellent game in its own right, it deserves extra praise since this survival horror flawlessly emulates the tension of Ridley Scott's sci-fi masterpiece. The reason why Creative Assembly's adaptation works so well is because the Xenomorph is freaking terrifying. Because this star beast can kill you in an instant, you can never rest easy. When you enter an empty room, you know the extraterrestrial can burst from a vent at any moment and slaughter you. And once this monstrosity has you in its sights, there's next to nothing you can do to shake it. Even though it's annoying to watch the Xenomorph kill you over and over, the game wouldn't work any other way. For Alien Isolation to capture the atmosphere of the source material, you should have a slim chance of survival every time the haunting creature is nearby. If you could overpower and outrun the alien with ease, it would be a disservice to the beloved property. Yes, the Xenomorph is a nightmare to face. Yes, it's going to murder you dozens of times and lay eggs in your face. But if you're a true Alien fan, well, you wouldn't want it any other way. Number 3. Jubilius, Bayonetta. At the end of Bayonetta, our cheeky witch arrives at the heavenly plane where she meets the mother of creation herself, Jubilius. With a mere thought, this divine being can summon an endless supply of angels, launch the natural elements at our heroine, or reshape reality. However, Jubilius' most terrifying attack is the black hole. If Bayonetta comes near this astronomic phenomenon, it's game over. When this is unleashed, you need to execute every dodge technique imaginable to avoid an instant death. Unfortunately, Jubilius can turn Bayonetta into a child, causing her to momentarily lose her powers. If this demonic deity drops a black hole while Bayonetta is de-aged, you're toast. Because Jubilius is the final boss, she should put up one hell of a fight. However, many players find her insta-kill attacks ridiculous, especially since they're nearly impossible to dodge. That being said, just as many fans believe Jubilius should be unfair since she's literally God. Bayonetta may be nifty with swords and guns, but her power is infinitesimal compared to the Alpha and the Omega. The fact that our heroine can last a second against Jubilius' eternal might is unbelievable, and because every character in the game emphasised that Jubilius was nigh omnipotent, it would have been anticlimactic if she was anything but unfathomably brutal. Number 2. M. Bison, Street Fighter II. Since the early days of gaming, cheap bosses have plagued every genre. However, such adversaries are surprisingly common in fighting games. I mean, look at Jinpachi, Shao Kahn, Azazel, Galactus, or Master Hand. Of course, how can anyone forget the granddaddy of them all, M. Bison? The Shadowloo leader can sweep you off your feet or hurl you around even if you're blocking. He can disable almost any special move with a single kick. His defining attack, the Psycho Crusher, eats up a third of your health bar. Simply put, M. Bison seems like the definitive cheap boss. But with the benefit of hindsight, M. Bison is actually the fairest villain in the franchise. Other Street Fighter foes like Gil and Seth are far less fair since they rely on regenerating health and unblockable combos. M. Bison's fighting pattern in the Street Fighter Alpha series is less reasonable because he relies on input reading. Now, that doesn't mean that M. Bison in Street Fighter 2 isn't infuriating, but since he's the final opponent, he was never going to fight fair, was he? He may be a nightmare, but M. Bison does provide an extraordinary challenge which many gamers crave. And number 1, Flame Lurker, Demon Souls. It's common knowledge nowadays that unforgivable bosses are package and parcel with From Software's work, but when the company released Demon Souls back in 2009, players couldn't have known the hell that they were in for. Even though this title is tough from the get-go, the Flame Lurker is the first chap you meet who feels like sadism incarnate. Because of the fire-tossing beast's propensity to seek you out, you have little time to heal, dodge, find your footing, or strategize. Due to the limited space, you're compelled to face Flame Lurker head-on, since you receive fire damage just by being near this living inferno. Inferno, it feels like you're screwed no matter what you do. Although some players believe Flame Lurker is too hard, others think he's the perfect introduction to what the Soulsborne franchise would come to be. By fighting a boss this unbearable early on, it demonstrated that there were more arduous encounters to come. Flame Lurker isn't just a monstrous boss, he serves as a warning that players need to up their game. If they hope to win, they need to get used to difficulty spikes and bosses who redefine the word unfair.
Have you ever fought a video game boss so hard that it made you think there was no way the developers could have made something even more trauma-inducing than what they just did? Well, if that's the case, you're only half wrong. With every great game title comes a great deal of cut content, and in some cases, this includes boss fights of ridiculous proportions. I'm Ewan, this is What Culture Gaming, and here are 10 video game bosses removed for being too hard. Number 10. SCP-689. SCP Containment Breach. SCP Containment Breach is a horror game based on the internet collaborative work of the same name. In the game, you play as one of the test subjects who tries to escape the SCP facility after something releases all of those dangerous anomalies kept inside. Containment Breach features quite an impressive number of SCPs that the player has to go up against. That said, the team behind the project had plans for even more monsters, including an SCP so overpowered they had to ultimately remove it from the game. SCP-689, known as the Hunter in the Dark, is a small statue of a creature sitting on a throne. The statue's powers remain dormant when someone is staring at it, but as soon as they look away, the statue disappears, and then 20 seconds later, the person dies an instantaneous death. The team behind the game mentioned that they tried to implement SCP-689 originally, but it was removed when they realized dooming players to an instant and guaranteed death was a little too over the top. I call it funny, but you know, apples and oranges. Number 9. Devil Joker. Persona 2 Innocent Sin. The plot of Persona 2 Innocent Sin revolves around the main characters trying to confront the mysterious villain called the Joker. Throughout the game, it is hinted that the Joker has two personalities, one of an angel and one of a devil. However, when you get to fight him, only his angelic form actually appears. This said, the Joker's devil form does actually exist in the game. It has a fully animated sprite, stats, a list of spells, even voice acting, and yet you don't ever get to fight it. This might seem strange, but all it takes is a quick glimpse at the Devil Joker's abilities, and you immediately realize why the devs opted out of using him. On top of his high stats, the Devil Joker has access to unique and absurdly overpowered abilities that would have been a hell to deal with had they been implemented into Persona 2. He would have been able to one-shot a party member with just one strike, and considering he was only supposed to be one segment of a larger boss, you can probably tell why this wouldn't have been a good idea. Number 8. Giant. Minecraft. Although most people associate Minecraft with building and exploring your creativity, it's still a survival game at its core. When not in creative mode, players spend every night fending off monsters, and there are plenty of special locations with bosses, unique enemies, and other types of challenging mobs. In fact, Minecraft even features a considerable list of unused enemies who didn't make the official roster because they either didn't fit in with what was already in the game, or because they proved too difficult to fight. And yeah, the scrapped idea for a giant zombie seems to fit more into the latter category than the former. Simply known as Giant, which is an apt name given it's a giant, the mob is an upscaled version of the regular zombie model with a whopping 100 points of health and a punch that is capable of instantly killing an unarmored player, like a blocky version of those giant inflicted deaths in Skyrim. So hilarious. The giant mob cannot be spawned normally, but since it is fully implemented in the game's data, you can technically bring it into your session using console commands. The devs likely left that option in so that players who think they're up to the challenge of fighting a giant zombie can have the chance to prove themselves, and then likely get squashed into a neat pile of items and experience points. Number 7. Cole. Dragon Age Inquisition. Cole is one of the several companions available in Dragon Age Inquisition. He's a spirit occupying the body of a boy he failed to save from death, which is why, despite his sweet and innocent personality, his otherworldly way of thinking can be somewhat disturbing. Additionally, Cole is more susceptible to the influence of the demonic invasion that's plaguing the world of Thedas. It was actually an aspect of his character that BioWare wanted to utilize more in the final act of the game, but it proved proved too brutal from a gameplay perspective. Originally, during the final fight with the main antagonist, Corypheus, Cole was supposed to betray your Inquisitor due to their power. If the player had Cole on their team, he would turn against them, and the final fight would require you to take down both him and Corypheus at the same time. Although a similar situation happens in the Trespasser DLC, with the Iron Bull potentially backstabbing you in the final act, the idea of Cole being an additional boss fight was scrapped as it proved brutal to fight both him and the final boss with only 3 people in your party. Number 6. The original Pandemonium Warden. Final Fantasy XI. Although most of the bosses on this list were removed by the developers prior to the release of their game, the Pandemonium Warden from Final Fantasy XI had to be replaced with a weaker version of himself after the fact. The iconic MMO had to patch his initial concept out of the game after a group of players was to have failed to defeat him after 18 uninterrupted hours of combat. Oh my god. Can you imagine how stinky it would have been in those rooms? As you may imagine, this sparked quite the outrage online, even though I probably would have given up after hour 3. But anyway, eventually Square Enix was forced to apply some serious patches to the Warden, completely changing the fight and making him much less of a threat. The replacement Warden had his health significantly reduced, his attack and other statistics diminished, and just to make sure no group of players would ever dare to spend such an ungodly amount of time fighting the monster again, the devs also forced him to despawn and reset every 2 hours. Number 5. The Tsar Dragon. Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy superstars are some of the most challenging encounters you'll face in any game. They're essentially enemies that are put into Final Fantasy for those players who think the final boss is just a bit too easy for their liking. However, there is one thing scarier than a super boss. A deleted super boss. Enter the Tsar Dragon, and can we get some cool entrance music here? Yeah, there he is. He's a removed boss fight with the leader of the other 8 super boss dragons in Final Fantasy VI. Though it only exists in the game's unused files, just looking at its exceedingly high stats is enough to realize that fighting the Tsar Dragon would have been the greatest challenge in all of Final Fantasy VI. So great, in fact, that it was rendered impossible by the developers and scrapped from the final product. Its massive health pool, mixed with attacks capable of downing 2 party members at once, is nothing to scoff at. But when you add in its ultimate ability too, hoo boy, the fight might as well just end with an auto-fail. Number 4. The Sky Chase Dragon. Sonic Adventure DX. Sonic Adventure is considered a certified classic among Sonic fans. It features plenty of fun levels, multiple characters to play as, and a considerable amount of challenging boss fights. On the latter front, it even has some bosses that didn't make the cut, one of which was removed due to the undesirable level of difficulty it brought to an existing fight. During Act 1 of Sonic's story, the player has to chase Robotnik's aircraft through the skies as his robotic minions shoot at you from all angles. The sequence is quite short and not very challenging, but that's because originally, the open sky behind Robotnik's carrier was supposed to be filled with more than just tiny drones. The leftover files in Sonic Adventure DX reveal that the sky chase sequences were originally going to feature a massive 2-headed dragon that would chase after Sonic and Tails, breathing fire and shooting laser beams from its eyes. Yeah, if this sounds excessive to you, then you realize exactly why the developers took it out of the game. It turns out a giant robotic dragon with lasers is a cool concept, but it can be tricky to dodge in a teeny tiny little red plane. Number 3. Removed Moon Presence. Bloodborne. The data folders of Bloodborne feature several unseen files of alternative versions of existing boss fights, as well as unseen bosses that never made the cut. One of the better known examples of this is the Great One Beast, which has its own moveset and model despite not being present in the game. However, a much more interesting case of a removed boss fight in Bloodborne is the alternative version of the final boss, the Moon Presence. Yep, in the original vision of Bloodborne's developers, the fight with the enigmatic Moon Presence was supposed to be completely different. The creature had a bigger and bulkier model with much larger tentacles that it would rely on heavily in the fight, unlike its slightly dumbed down in the game counterpart. The removed version of the Moon Presence also had a far greater reach, and the place in which you fought it was a dark cathedral hall instead of the large illuminated field that you see in the final version of the game. Given that the Moon Presence is one of the hardest bosses in Bloodborne, a more advanced version of it with additional skills and tricks would have hurt me very deeply. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, cosmically, I would have been a husk before its presence. Number 2. Original Gravelord Nioh, Dark Souls. Similar to Bloodborne, the Dark Souls series features quite a few altered and removed boss fights that exist only as leftover files in game folders. Though most of these files don't say much about what the fight could have looked like, the unused data regarding one of the existing bosses, Gravelord Nioh, leads to some fascinating conclusions. The original fight with the First of the Dead was supposed to be much harder than the final product. Instead of just fighting Nioh and a handful of skeletons present in his room at the start of the battle, Nioh would be capable of spawning up to 7 additional skeletons that would pop out of his body as it got progressively more damaged. Towards the end of the battle, the room would be completely flooded by his undead minions, making it infinitely more difficult and intense. Considering that none of these mechanics are present in the released version of Dark Souls, it's likely that the From Software developers thought their original concept of the boss was too difficult to handle. And considering how hard the in-game bosses are, that's a pretty scary thought. And number 1, the Hydra. Half-Life 2. Half-Life 2 has so much cut content that it requires an entire timeline divided into subsections in order to understand it. Some things that never made it into the final version were worked on for months, and sometimes even years, before someone on the development team decided they didn't really work for the game. One such concept was the Hydra, a unique water-based monster that Valve cut out of Half-Life 2 for being too hard to defeat. The Hydra was supposed to be a translucent hive mind of deadly tentacles that would appear throughout the city's sewers to kill anything that intruded upon its territory. Each tentacle came equipped with different weapons and abilities, making each encounter with the creature both unique and unnerving, as you never know when the next tentacle would appear or what it would be capable of. Valve worked on the Hydra for a long time. The creature had a complete in-game model and even a fully designed moveset, but it was scrapped at the last moment due to its wriggling and lanky tentacles proving too difficult to fight in a 3D environment.
The further into a video game you go, the harder things should get, but we've all had those experiences of unexpected difficulty spikes. It can be daunting when a video game throws something truly challenging at us early on, but it does happen, and those boss fights can stick with us for all the right or wrong reasons, and sometimes both. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 needlessly hard early video game bosses. Number 10. Berserker, Gears of War. At its core, Gears of War is a series about buff men with big frigging guns blasting their way to victory through the unfortunate bodies of disgusting monsters. Pull the trigger and have some fun. The thing with the Berserker is it totally throws players off and changes the momentum of the game. Rather than being all about firing as much ammo as possible into anything non-human that moves, the Berserker needs to be taken down by leading it out into the open. Time to use your brains, Marcus Phoenix, and rest that brawn for just a few moments. It's not just about avoiding the Berserker, it's about drawing it towards the door and moving at just the right moment so that it pops it off its hinges. Repeat this a few times and you can drag the aggravated beast out into the open air, where you can then take it down in spectacular fashion with the laser-guided Hammer of Dawn. To some extent, the battle is all about knowing your surroundings, as getting caught in a corner or stuck on a pillar can cause your very squished downfall quickly. With no way to brute force the battle, you've got only the dodge button and your wits to see you through. Hope you limbered up. Number 9. Brock, Pokémon Red and Blue. One of the often overlooked things about many Pokémon games is their baked-in difficulty modifier. The games themselves don't have any selectable choices, but it comes down to whatever starter Pokémon you pick. For example, in Pokémon Red and Blue, you're going to have the easiest time against the first 2 gym leader type preferences, Rock and Water, by taking Bulbasaur. Squirtle will get you moving, but not quite as swiftly. Charmander, however, is what you take if you want to struggle. That being said, the game never expresses this, and a lot of players just pick Charmander because they like the design or its array of fire-based skills, which are much more uncommon throughout the region. Players who go with the flame-breathing lizard will hit a brick wall against Rock if they haven't trained enough or diversified their team. Since there's no way to catch a grass or water type yet to get those super effective hits, you'll have to make do with the likes of Charmander's Ember or a Butterfree's Confusion to make a dent in those defenses. In the 2004 remakes, Fire Red and Leaf Green, Charmander can learn Metal Claw, which gives it a fighting chance, thus making it easier to send Brock crying to his beloved Nurse Joy. Number 7. Zangetsu, Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night. As a spiritual successor to Castlevania, it's no surprise that Bloodstained Ritual of the Night is on the tough side of things. Whilst its first boss fight sets up what to expect from the difficulty of the title, it's actually the next showdown that can really cause some stress. Zangetsu is the first boss in the castle where the majority of the game takes place. Also, he represents a neat connection to the spin-off game Curse of the Moon, where he was the main playable character. Zangetsu's output of damage isn't necessarily the entire problem, it's its speed that causes an issue. With a selection of attacks that look pretty similar, he can be hard to read and dodge accordingly, and can dish out the punishment if you can't make enough space between you and his sword, which, halfway through the fight, he sets ablaze and gains a ton of extra range on. If at this point you don't know if Bloodstained is for you, this would be the moment of truth. Thankfully, Ritual of the Night, like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, has RPG elements, so you can power level to increase your chances against Zangetsu. That is, if you don't mind going around and around in the same loop of rooms, as the area of the castle you can explore that early into the game is rather small. Number 6. Tree Sentinel, Elden Ring. It wouldn't be a list about difficult boss fights without an entry on a From Software game, who are quite literally responsible for pages of responses when you Google search hard video game bosses. That's not a cheeky opening line, it's just a fact. The first enemy every player encounters in Elden Ring outside of the tutorial, guaranteed, is the Tree Sentinel. It sets the stage for the game, especially for those who have never touched a From Software title up until that point, by absolutely battering anyone that comes close enough. Bold and or stubborn players will see this immediate challenge and face it down for as long as it takes, however. But despite being the first enemy in the game, the intention is not for players to overcome it until much later. Get yourself a good few level ups and a horse and you stand a much better chance. You're better off not trying to brute force this one. The entire concept of the Tree Sentinel is that it's placed there to basically force players to go elsewhere, to show them that, unlike Dark Souls and Bloodborne, this is not a linear experience. If you get absolutely rocked by a creature, it's okay to look for another path and explore somewhere else. I mean, you're probably going to get mauled by whatever lurks there too, but that's the FromSoft experience for you. Number 5. Commissioner, Streets of Rage 4. After 26 years with no new releases, Streets of Rage 4 brought back the beloved Mega Drive side-scrolling beat-em-up with full pomp and circumstance. The art style is gorgeous, the soundtrack is fantastic, and the boss battles are agonizingly hard. Seriously, the final boss of this game is truly a test of willpower, but that doesn't mean the early stages of the game are a cakewalk. Mission 2 explores the corrupt police precinct and faces players off against the Commissioner. He may look like no spring chicken, but he has both power and speed on his side. If you're in his way when he flashes white, then he'll curl you up like a basketball and throw you down to the ground, causing some damage and also putting you prone and in further jeopardy. Considering the Commissioner can summon various police officers into the fight, it can get messy fast, harder to avoid the boss's big attacks and more vulnerable after the fact. As the battle progresses, his likelihood of getting a grasp on you increases, making this one a battle that gets noticeably tougher as it goes on. At least its battle theme is a funky little jam that won't get old, even if you have to hear it several times over. Number 4. Deathstroke, Batman Arkham Origins. Standard combat in the Arkham games is rewarding and mindless fun, putting you in the big spiked boots of Batman and all those rippling muscles. Pulling off great combos and flying from foe to foe feels good. Deathstroke puts his foot down on being treated like any other goon. Batman Arkham Origins is set on December 24th, as Batman has to subdue 8 assassins sent to make his crime-fighting ways a thing of the past. Perhaps as a nod to the Arkham Asylum fight with Bane, which required players to use context clues and well-timed maneuvers, Arkham Origins' first boss fight with Deathstroke slows things right down. Wailing on the assassin is all well and good, but if you don't have your counters timed out right, then you're going to have a pretty rough time. In the second phase, Deathstroke doesn't hold back, and if you slip up, it's curtains for the Cape Crusader, as missing too many will result in a game over. The battle is slow and arduous at the best of times, and culminates in Deathstroke throwing explosive canisters that need to be caught mid-air just to top it all off. Not only is this an early boss fight in the game, Deathstroke is the first of 8 assassins that Batman has to contend with. Talk about a disappointing Christmas gift. Number 3. Soul Master, Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania set in a beautiful dark world of underground bugs, beautiful music, and total unfettered frustration. Many of the game's boss fights are an uphill battle all by themselves, but Soul Master is specifically memorable for being quite an early entry in the game's list of tough as nails foes. Soulmaster's attacks are a perfect example of how a lot of Hollow Knight boss fights work and demonstrate that timing is everything, not just acting as fast as possible, but waiting for the right moment. The bug's projectile attacks will make your palms sweaty and your heart stop as you wait to jump at the right moment to make it clear of them without dropping straight back onto them. He's also incredibly fast, so the window for reading attacks takes some practice, as does actually picking your spots to get your shots in. The boss will take several minutes to quell on a successful attempt, but those minutes will feel like a lifetime as you wait to chip away at his health bar. Never let the weird but cute aesthetic of Hollow Knight fool you. This game does not want to hold your hand. Soulmaster specifically will do his darndest to crush you back for all the helpless insects you crushed along the way. Number 2. Phantom, Devil May Cry. It's all well and good giving your boss enemy a weak point to focus on, but you've got to make it obvious and easy to hit. Think Zelda and its obnoxiously large eyeballs on every boss. That's the ticket. On the total opposite end of the spectrum, Devil May Cry laughs in your face and gives you Phantom. Phantom is a lava-spewing arachnid that is covered in indestructible molten rock, which makes him a pretty tough boss to face off, as you can't just go in all guns blazing and you really need to pick your spots. You'd think that would be simple enough considering it's the first boss of the game, but Phantom doesn't care much for being shot in the face and will do its damnedest to throw you off. Fireballs and pillars of lavas will keep you figuratively on your toes and literally off them, asking Dante to perform some pretty nifty acrobatics if he doesn't want to be toasted alive. With ranged attacks and all those legs and a scorpion-like tail to deal with up close, most players will be pretty thrown off when it comes to where they should be standing or fighting from. Probably best to leave this thing and call it a day, Dante. You've only come so far, you've still got time to turn back around. Number 1. Eudix Gundyr, Dark Souls 3. The first boss of Dark Souls 3, Eudix Gundyr, is a corrupted champion knight that is found kneeling and waiting for the player at the end of the tutorial. Removing the sword from his chest causes him to rise to the occasion, dwarfing the Ashen One and putting the fear of God in players. If you figured you had Dark Souls sussed out and thought you could get through on the third entry by turtling up with a sword and shield, then Eudix Gundyr is here to rain on your parade. The only way to take Eudix down is through careful ducking and weaving, getting your hits in where you can and retreating back out of the range of his swinging halberd. As with every Dark Souls boss, it's try and try again until you memorize a pattern or find a solution that works for you, and once you start getting the upper hand on Eudix Gundyr, you'll start to feel pretty damn smug about it. That is, until he suddenly transforms into this awful leech-covered lizard monstrosity that can undo that progress you've made pretty darn quickly. With more range and more power than ever before, this thing is not messing around. Dark Souls and difficulty are fine wine and cheese, but making your tutorial boss this hard just seems like a whole new level of cruelty.
Now, there's an endless amount of folk who just love to kick back with a good video game to escape the mundanity of real life. However, some players go beyond casual fun, dedicating so much time and effort to honing their skills with a controller that they transcend the average and become something else. The hardcore gamer. Oh my. Now, these hardcore gamers like to make themselves known, but there's no denying their skill when it comes to defeating certain enemies or getting through very difficult areas. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about today. About the bosses that only the hardcore could beat. So let's take a look, as I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video game bosses only hardcore players beat. Number 10. The Riddler, Batman Arkham Knight. Now, Batman has an exceptional array of villains in his catalogue, and as such, the Arkham series has seen rise to many great boss encounters, and the Riddler showdown from Arkham Knight is certainly not one of the toughest in that lineup, but actually getting to that showdown at all is a nigh impossible task, especially without a guide. In order to unlock this fight, you need to beat Edward Nygma at his own game, i.e. solving every single riddle, finding every single trophy, shattering every breakable object, and stopping every bomb rioter. Just for the record, there are 243 Riddler puzzles in Gotham, and it will take you hours to beat all of them, even if you're using cheats. At the end, Riddler's fight isn't too grueling. It's certainly no Mr. Freeze from Arkham City or Bane from Arkham Origins, but again, your levels of patience and dedication to get this last boss and achieve the game's true ending, well, they need to soar higher than Wayne Tower. Even the most hardcore fans questioned whether this fight and the true ending were worth it after dragging this guy to the GCPD. Number 9. Sans, Undertale. Undertale is, in many ways, a game for gamers. The reliance on messing with classic tropes, in-jokes, and tough gameplay moments are like personal treats for those who adore the medium. As such, it's no surprise that it comes with an exceptionally tough boss fight for those willing to seek it out. But by God, you've got to be brave to tangle with Sans. Getting to the Sans boss fight requires a few things, the most important being patience, skill, dedication, and a lack of empathy for all the inhabitants of the underground, as you'll only encounter this boss if you complete one of the game's infamous genocide runs. Therein lies lies the first challenge, as this requires you to kill every single creature in each area, which can be a true chore. But if you kill everything, you'll eventually be forced into this particular duel, and just like the game says, well, you're gonna have a bad time. Sans is a real backbreaker of a fight, coming at you with insane attacks. He throws projectiles, a tough-to-dodge blue soul mode, and plenty more your way. Hell, it's even implied that he's self-aware, pointing out that he knows that you can save and restart, doing so himself a few times. Number 8. The Yellow King. Fear and Hunger. And this game is often called the RPG that utterly hates you due to its immense difficulty and cruelty. Thanks to this, every boss could have had a place on its list, as only hardcore players ever dream of finishing it. Fear and Hunger is a dungeon crawler RPG that sees you venture into a dangerous pit of despair, and you'll have your fair share of encounters with terrifying enemies who can one-shot you no problem, and this includes some rather painful boss battles. But when picking out a boss to single out though, it has to be the Yellow King. This finale stage enemy is one of several that you can encounter in the game's 5 regular endings, and Ending C will put you in the path of this monstrous deity after one of your party members ascends to godhood. A hardcore fight to reach for many reasons. For one, you actually have to make it to the end of the game, and second, you need to keep a specific party member alive, which is almost an impossible task, and thirdly, well, it's just hard as hell. The Yellow King has an incredible health pool and some horrible spell attacks that can do massive damage. Plus, unlike the other final boss, you have to fight him directly after defeating another final boss, so the odds are so stacked against you, it's almost too unfair. Number 7. Emil. Nier Automata. Potato Patata. This is yet another boss encounter that combines the horrible task of completing a demanding series of requirements to unlock the fight, then the fight itself being an absolute controller killer, as if Nier Automata, Potato Patata players hadn't suffered enough already, right? This phenomenal action RPG features an NPC named Emil, a beloved character from the first Nier. He appears in the sequel as a merchant and a quest giver. However, you can find a more dangerous side to his character if you take the steps required to achieve one of the game's secret endings, morphing Emil into a horrendous boss. To get to this fight, you must first fully max out every available weapon in the game and finish Emil's Memories side quest. Once you eventually get to the battle, it's no easy feat, as you must contend with an army of massive Emil heads who strike at you with devastating bomb and laser attacks. The boss is also level 99, which really helps turn up the heat. This is a really easy encounter to miss and an even harder one to finish once you've got started. Number 6. The Azamat. Final Fantasy XII. Okay, I'm just gonna say it here. Any boss that has over 50 million HP, no. I'm sad looking at this footage. I don't want to spend all of a working day to fight this one boss, especially one that can heal if you leave the battle arena. No, I'm done with you. Number 5. The Nameless King. Dark Souls 3. Yes, of course, Dark Souls was going to make it on this list. Everybody saw that coming. This iconic franchise is known for its harsh but fair difficulty and always provides a healthy challenge for players who want to test themselves. Still, the challenge for this boss is about as healthy as eating 3 Big Macs for breakfast. The Nameless King is an optional boss who rides into battle on a massive storm drake known as the King of the Storm. Oh, and you have to fight that dragon as well. This fight will test the limits of your reflexes, as you'll need the tightest of precision to dodge all of his attacks. In addition, Nameless King's strikes are more than capable of one-shotting you, so 1 or 2 wrong moves and you'll be absolutely obliterated. Many fans consider this to be one of the hardest bosses in all of Dark Souls, and only the most hardcore players have even witnessed the King's demise. Number 3. Orphan of Kos. Bloodborne. Looks like Soulsborne is back on the menu. As per usual, From Software delivered yet another brutal optional boss that caused players the world over to feel like taking a bite out of their controllers. The Orphan of Kos is the final boss of the Old Hunters DLC. That certainly doesn't look like much at first, appearing weak, skeletal, and misshapen, but don't let that appearance fool you, as once you enter this boss's aggro radius, it becomes an unmatched fury. Speed and power are at the forefront of this creature, and the Orphan is incredibly agile and has some insane striking power, with close range and distance attacks that are an absolute chore to avoid. Only a true master of this game will be able to tackle this beast and come out victorious. This is also not a battle to go into with a full stomach, as the villain hits you with all the gooey body horror that you can expect from a Bloodborne boss. Hell, it even uses a placenta as a devastating close combat weapon, so consider yourself frustrated and grossed out in equal measure. Number 2. Keraferm the Sleeper. EverQuest. The Awakening of Keraferm is a fascinating piece of gaming history and a boss that no one can beat again. And this is because firstly, it was only ever intended to spawn once, and secondly, it was mechanically and narratively designed to be unbeatable. Appearing in MMORPG EverQuest, each server got one chance to battle it. However, thanks to its ludicrous HP and insurmountable power, it was impossible to take the beast down. Now this was all by design, as the game's story dictated that the giant beast rampaged through the land. Each server fell one by one, and it would have gone on forever if not for the final server, Ralos Zek. This hardcore group of players battled against this boss with a tedious strategy, mainly reviving players and slowly chipping away at its health. And the boss had never lost even 1% of its health before, but their strategy got it down to 26%. This was such a shock to the developers at Sony Online Entertainment, to the point that they were forced to despawn Keraferm to save the integrity of their so-called unkillable boss. Such a response didn't go down well, and the devs apologized and returned the dragon back to its former state. The battle commenced again, and after 3 supremely intense hours, Ralos Zek were successful. Was it worth it? Who knows? But nothing says hardcore more like forcing the developers to change their own game because of your skills.
When you think about a game's structure, it's logical to assume that the final boss is going to be the hardest challenge. After all, they are the climactic showdown, the final test of the player's skill that stands in their way to victory. But in reality, there are many final bosses who pale in comparison to those that the game developers consider to be completely irrelevant to the main story. So with that in mind, I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 optional bosses harder than the final boss. Number 10, the Valkyries, God of War 2018. Take any boss fight from the 2018 God of War and it'll be a fun and challenging experience. Each godlike being you come across has something interesting up their sleeve, so things rarely get stale or repetitive. Maybe except for those identical rock monsters perhaps. Still, if you beat the main part of the game and feel like even the final duel with Baldur didn't quench your thirst for battle, the game's true challenge is actually still waiting ahead. I am of course talking about the 8 Valkyries you can find and duel after finishing the game. The first 2 are pretty simple to beat, but their remaining sisters are no joke. They're absolutely ruthless, and without the proper equipment and skill setup, the player will not be able to take them down easily. Each Valkyrie utilizes a unique tactic to give you a personalized hell on earth. One, for example, shrouds the battle arena in darkness to confuse you, while another showers it with literal fire from the sky. And as if difficulty wasn't enough, they also look infinitely more terrifying than some scrawny shirtless dude with a mullet. Number 9, Ruby Weapon, Final Fantasy VII. The Final Fantasy series has a long tradition of insanely difficult optional bosses. Pretty much every title in the series includes some kind of super boss that exists solely to offer the player a challenge after they've already done everything else there is to do. The most famous example of this perhaps is Ruby Weapon, one of the 2 super bosses from Final Fantasy VII. The Ruby Weapon is a huge mech with razor-sharp claws and a snake-like head that breathes fire. It can be encountered near the Gold Saucer after the player defeats the ultimate weapon, which in retrospect may not be as ultimate as its creators had hoped for. The fight with Ruby Weapon requires a ridiculous amount of grinding to give the player even the slightest bit of chance to stand their ground. The mech is a ruthless damage dealer, and without using some shrewd tactics, it's basically impossible to beat. After taking down Ruby Weapon, even Sephiroth himself will feel like a pushover. Number 8, Dettlaff, The Witcher 3. The Blood and Wine DLC for The Witcher 3 is considered to be one of the greatest expansion packs in video game history. It features the beautiful region of Toussaint, plenty of new missions, and a boss fight that completely outshines Eredin's pathetic attempt at being the game's main antagonist. The DLC revolves around capturing the so-called Beast of Beauclair, who in reality is a very old and very powerful higher vampire named Dettlaff. Depending on which choices the player makes throughout their mission in Toussaint, Geralt can end up fighting Dettlaff, and as soon as the man turns into his true vampiric form, you realise that the Wild Hunt is probably the least of the Witcher's worries. With the ability to fly, teleport, spawn hordes of bats, and even warp reality itself, Dettlaff takes a considerable amount of skill and preparation to take down. The player really needs to get a good understanding of his moveset and use all of the advantages at their disposal in order to bring him to his knees. He even has 3 distinct phases in his fight, once again putting Eredin and his 2-stage duel to shame. Number 7, Gex Kang the Unbound, Dragon Age Origins. Those who have played Dragon Age Origins tend to agree that as difficult as the final fight with the Archdemon is, he is by no means the strongest boss in the game. This title is either a attributed to the High Dragon in Haven or a more unassuming figure called Gex Kang the Unbound. Gex Kang is a powerful demon who hides among mortals under the guise of an old man. He's an entirely optional boss, so much so that the player needs to look all over the world before they can even find him cooped up in his tiny hovel in Denerim. There are two main reasons why Gex Kang is significantly more troublesome than the Archdemon. The first one is the fact that Gex Kang wields an impressive roster of spells. He can disrupt your allies, disable their own magical abilities, and most annoyingly, heal an insane amount of health. The second is the environment. Whereas the final battle with the Archdemon takes place in a huge arena that can fill up with your allies, Gex Kang fights your warden inside a tiny cramped room, making it difficult to use the terrain to your advantage. Who knew single studio apartments made for such excellent combat environments? Number 6, Morgan Freeman, South Park: The Fractured But Whole. The second South Park game doesn't just take the cake for having the best subtitle in video game history, but also for confirming that Morgan Freeman is the most powerful figure in the universe. Yes, in a very Bruce Almighty fashion, the South Park version of Morgan Freeman is an unassuming godlike being with abilities that can take down your entire squad with little to no effort. Even though the main storyline has you fighting dangerous criminals, mutated monsters, and even a literal eldritch god, none of them are even remotely as powerful as Morgan Freeman pretending to be an ordinary employee of a local taqueria. The fight is easily the hardest battle in the game, and funnily enough, it can only be triggered if the player asks for it. Morgan will only decide to fight you if you punch him on the world map, and even then he has the patience to let you do it a few times before he finally snaps and wipes the floor of his taco shop with you. Don't mess with the freckled god. Number 5, Ebony Warrior: The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Although Skyrim has been around for more than a decade now, prolonging its existence with countless remasters and platform ports, there are still some things that only a fraction of its player base have seen and experienced. One of them is the Ebony Warrior, the game's true challenge for only the most dedicated Dragonborn. The Ebony Warrior is the hardest enemy in the game and appears only after the player reaches level 80. He personally seeks out the Dragonborn to issue a challenge stating that no other person has ever bested him and that perhaps the legendary warriors of Skyrim could be the ones to finally send his soul to Sovngarde. His claim of never getting bested is no joke, as the warrior's gear and abilities are the deadliest combination you'll ever see in the game. His armor provides him with 50% resistance to every type of damage in the title, his perks allow him to deal maximum damage, and as if that wasn't enough, he can also reflect some of the Dragonborn's attacks right back at them. The duel with the Ebony Warrior is truly the greatest challenge in Skyrim. Considering his skill, it's surprising he didn't beat you to killing Alduin himself. Number 4, Elder Dragon: Monster Hunter World Iceborne. The concept of dangerous first-class monsters and special assignments has been a part of the Monster Hunter series for a very long time. It started with the Elder Dragon Vitalis and his initial appearance in Monster Hunter for the PlayStation 2. The Black Dragon was one of the most dangerous creatures in the game's universe, and only select hunters could be called upon to fight him. For good reason, as this colossal lizard boy was seriously no joke. This tradition of limited-time special monsters has persisted throughout the entire franchise to this day, and even Vitalis himself makes a return in the recent Monster Hunter World DLC, Iceborne. The dragon is part of a special event that you can unlock after finishing Iceborne's main campaign. He's the largest and most powerful creature in the game, which is why players shouldn't even think of going after him without reaching at least Master Rank 100. Even then, it might take you a while to kill him, as he has an insane amount of health and 3 different phases, and you only have 30 minutes to complete the assignment. Compared to him, the final boss is simply an oversized gecko with wings. Number 3, Kurt Zisa. Kurt Zisa is an emblem heartless that the player can encounter in the desert of Agrabah in the Aladdin level. Despite being an optional boss, he is considered one of the hardest encounters in the original game, even outdoing Sephiroth himself. You know, for arguably the most iconic Final Fantasy villain, Sephiroth isn't half getting buried in this video. Zisa's difficulty comes from the ridiculous number of phases and battle modes he has. In one stage of the fight, he can completely block your magic attacks. In another, he will become immune to physical attacks instead and force you to rely exclusively on magic. In addition, each phase gives him a new attack mode to use against you, so anytime you think you've learned his moveset, he can surprise you with another trick. Everything about fighting Kurt Zisa is a weird case of trial and error that you don't really experience with other bosses, including Ansem at the end of the game. He's an utterly unpredictable enemy who rarely lets you catch a break. Also, did you know that Kurt's name was the result of a real-life contest? He was named after a lucky winner from New York who was probably really confused to furiously scream his own name every time the in-game Kurt was absolutely destroying him. Number 2, the Master, Paper Mario. When you think of the main antagonist of the Mario universe, the first character that surely comes to mind is Bowser. Indeed, even Paper Mario includes Bowser as its primary villain and the game's final boss, and yet he is nowhere close to being its strongest enemy. That would actually be one of Paper Mario's optional mini-bosses called the Master. As the name suggests, the Master is the owner of a dojo in Toad Town. He's a skilled martial artist who lets Mario use his experience to hone his fighting skills against his students. If the player manages to defeat both of them, they can even issue a challenge to the master himself. You get to fight him 3 times in total, and although the first battle isn't anything to write home about, the master becomes more powerful with each defeat. By the third fight, his HP and attack power have grown so exponentially that they completely overshadow Bowser's stats in the final act of the game, which must be pretty embarrassing for Bowser, knowing he's weaker than some random old toad giving free judo classes to little children. And number 1, Millennia, Elden Ring. Compared to other From Software titles, Elden Ring is an overall improvement in every aspect. Its open world is more expansive, its combat more advanced, and its final 2 bosses, Ragaddon and the Elden Beast, are much harder than their counterparts from Dark Souls. However, for some reason, Ragaddon and the Beast aren't considered the hardest bosses in Elden Ring. That title belongs to Millennia, who the fans almost unanimously agree is the most challenging boss in the game, despite being entirely optional. And why is that? Well, the difficulty of the fight with Ragaddon and the Beast comes from its length. Their attack patterns are pretty straightforward, it's just that the player needs to endure them for a long time. Millennia, on the other hand, can be beaten significantly faster, but has plenty of annoying mechanics, mainly the ability to heal herself through blocked attacks. Just a few wrong moves on the player's part, and Millennia can recover most of her health, bringing the fight back to square one, except the player has already exhausted most of their own health and supplies. Who needs healing flasks when you can just scrape HP off of your opponent's shield?
Boss battles are a long-standing tradition in most video games. Even ones that don't have combat will often have a difficulty spike, or you have to use what you've learned or unlocked to your utmost capability to get past. Anyone in video games development will tell you though that crafting a good boss battle is often one of the most difficult aspects of a game. There are certainly some incredible boss battles out there, but one thing that both good and bad boss battles have in common is the fact that if you walk into them unready, or sometimes even totally ready, you'll see that game over screen before you know it. Even knowing what's coming in a game you've beaten before, you can find yourself muttering obscenities as you reload from your last save. Here are the boss battles that made you see the developers finally crafted game over screen, and probably more than once. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 video game bosses you always game over on. Number 10. Omega Pirate, Metroid Prime. The Phase 1 Mine section of Metroid Prime is an often contentious stage in the game, even in the remastered edition. With an easily missed save spot before you head into the mines, you can really go into the zone without proper preparation. After going through 3 levels of tough enemies, including ones that can cloak and ambush you, you'll finally wind up in the elite quarters of the 3rd level, looking upon the gigantic Phase-on enriched Omega Pirate in stasis. Cue boss battle. Omega Pirate is just about every trope of BS you can shoehorn into a boss battle. Shoot the glowing orbs on his body to make it vulnerable, it's immune to half your weapons, it'll summon minions to protect it, oh, and of course it goes invisible and heals itself. Hope you brought enough missiles and bombs. If you die at any point during the boss battle, it's all the way back to the start with you, which was likely an hour or 2 ago. Oh, and did I mention this is your only chance to scan for the Omega Pirate's log? So if you missed that before the battle, or couldn't survive doing it mid-fight and you want to 100% the game, you'd better reload that old save and do it all again. Number 9. Mishima Jinpachi, Tekken 5. While most of the members of the Mishima family are ruthless, power-hungry, murderous curs, the once patriarch of the family, Jinpachi, was a kind and gentle man, known for his honor and wisdom. He initially founded the powerful Mishima Zaibatsu and grew it to the megacorp status it enjoys during the game's timeline. Now, Jinpachi's only mentioned in most of the Tekken series, but in Tekken 5 Dark Resurrection, the truth comes out with his appearance. Heihachi took over the Mishima Zaibatsu from his father Jinpachi and imprisoned the poor man underneath the family temple where the once powerful patriarch starved to death. Cut to Tekken 5's timeline some 5 decades later, and Jinpachi is resurrected by a demon who controls him and forces him to work toward gathering the strongest fighters in the world, part of a plan to destroy the whole planet. Now, this guy's moves are some of the fastest in the series, with powerful techniques able to hit quicker than some characters' jabs, and a number of Mishima family-style juggling combos to boot. He can also shout a devastating fireball that can sap half your health bar, and even has an instant "you're stunned" move that's unblockable and hits no matter where you are or what you're doing. Imagine how tough Heihachi must have been in his youth to have beaten this guy in the first place. Number 8. Lu Bu, Dynasty Warriors 3. Lu Bu is the penultimate character of the Dynasty Warriors series, even going so far as the first game, which was actually a fighting game. Lu Bu was the final end boss, and admittedly he was incredibly tough, but fair, which is an unusual thing for a fighting game. In the first hack and slash of the series, Dynasty Warriors 2, he was made a bit less fair, but was still fightable. Due to the narrative that DW is based on, he actually appears fairly early on in the story, so the players often advised not to fight him. And his difficulty has waxed and waned in various games of the series, but DW3 was the first true reminder that he was the boss, no matter what. Given you're fighting him at the second stage and you're probably going to be pretty low leveled, Lu Bu is not easily beaten, if beatable at all. He's got long range, he's super quick, can block or deflect your ultimate attacks, has tons of HP, and hits like a freight elephant. He also shows up on the fastest horse in the game, so even if you decide to back off, he can still outpace you if he doesn't want to let you leave alive. As most NPCs say in the game, do not pursue Lu Bu. Maybe he's just mad they've been mispronouncing his name for more than 2 decades, and hopefully I didn't do that for this whole entry. Number 6. Sinistar. For those of you too young to remember the early arcade game scene, developers realized very quickly that making super tough games was the best way of making money. Sinistar was one of the many arcade games of the 1980s built with the premise of making players shed quarters at the highest possible rate. The game has a simple premise. You're a lone starfighter mining crystals from asteroids in order to make a set of powerful homing missiles to defeat an evil living starship known as Sinistar. When you start the game, you've got some time to get ready because the enemies have to first build the ship. They do this by competing against you in mining the asteroids and then gathering together to build the giant lion-faced space vessel. And once he's built, you, that's what. Sinistar will call you a coward, tell you to run, and that he hungers for you. And by the way, he moves a lot faster than you do. It takes a total of 13 of the homing missiles to defeat him, and you die when one of his minions shoots you or if he touches you. Once he's built, he's in the game until you manage to beat him or run out of lives, so good luck. Number 4. Lord Hawkwind, Wizardry IV. Long before the days of Elden Ring and its brethren, there were games still out there which were difficult for the pure sake of being difficult. Older gamers will certainly think of the Wizardry series when asked about extremely difficult games of the 80s. And Wizardry IV Return of Wordner is not only different to the previous entries, it's also significantly more difficult. Speaking of previous entries, one neat aspect of the game was that gamers could send in all their saved games from earlier entries to see their characters in Wizardry IV, which is cool and all, but why, might you ask? Well, that's because in 4 you play as the villain from 3 trying to regain his lost powers and climb out of the 10-level dungeon he was thrown into by the last trilogy's heroes. And if that wasn't hard enough for you, take the final boss of the Temple of Kant, Lord Hawkwind. A self-insert Gary Stew of one of the developers, Hawkwind, the elven ninja, is basically invincible and can one-shot you, unless you have one of the lowest strength enemies, a dink. So unless you mapped out the first 4 levels of the game on graph paper by hand to see the word dink spelled out, you got here and died. No chance of victory. There's a reason 4 isn't often included in talks of remasters. Number 3. Giacomo, Baten Kaitos, Eternal Wings in the Lost Ocean. Giacomo is a returning enemy in all the Baten Kaitos games, and is also infamous for being one of the tougher little gits in the game. Arguably, his hardest version is in the first game in the series, along with his 2 cohorts, Amy and Fallon, who are colloquially called the Chaotic Trio due to their boss battle theme. The part that makes it super hard is that, aside from Fallon doing massive damage, and Amy's annoying multi-hit special attack, is that there's a save point just before the battle. Now, usually, that's a good thing, right? Nope, not if there's no way to go back to an earlier location and grind some levels if you're not strong enough. Going into the battle under level 25 is largely considered to be an inevitable defeat, if not a quick one. And unless you diversified your saves, you're stuck here in an unbeatable battle. Congratulations on having to start the game over and grinding before you get to the battleship. Number 2. Rebel Flagship, FTL Faster Than Light. As with most roguelike and roguelite games, any run of indie studio subset games as FTL Faster Than Light can be wildly different from another. If you do make it to the end though, then congratulations, you're about to hate it. After painstakingly going from zone to zone, piecing together a functional warship from parts you've scavenged, purchased, traded for, and lucked into, you wind up bow to bow with the Rebel Flagship. It doesn't matter how lucky you've been. At best, you're basically a destroyer up against a battleship. The Rebel flagship has multiple stages to it. It has tough shields, strong armor, and a lot of firepower to throw at you. Given the fact that the creators of the game estimated that only 10% of players would be able to beat the Rebel flagship, it's a wild guess you probably weren't one of them.
Now, because video game bosses are designed to test players, they need to provide a monumental challenge. But no matter how tough these enemies are, you should emerge triumphant after you've memorized their patterns. However, things get a lot trickier when you have to face two foes simultaneously. Although dealing with an extra baddie doesn't sound like a big deal, dual bosses, well, they're usually the hardest part of any game. So let's take a look at them today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are the 10 hardest dual boss fights in gaming history. Number 10. Junie and Julie, Street Fighter Alpha 3. Now, before we begin this one, can we just express how good Street Fighter Alpha 3 is? Yes, 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 thank you. And this game concludes with the player going mano a mano with M. Bison. No big surprises there, but before fighting the maniacal dictator, certain combatants must fight Bison's clones, Junie and Julie. Although these henchwomen are literally head swaps of Cammy, they're not to be underestimated. As soon as your opponents are on both sides of you, you'll be left completely vulnerable. Because you can't block from both directions simultaneously, it's really hard to evade attacks. If you land a solid combo on one enemy, it can be interrupted at any point if her partner lands a single blow on you. However, the most annoying thing about this battle isn't actually the boss itself, but the controls. Because if you want to block an attack, you have to press back on the D-pad. But if Junie and Julia are on both sides of you, the controls might register back as forward, preventing you from blocking entirely. It also makes it tricky to perform pretty much any move at all. After all, how can you fire off a Hadouken if the controls register down forward punch as down back punch? Because of this, the best way to defeat these clones are to flail maniacally rather than relying on any strategy or timing, and that doth not a good fighting experience make. Number 9. Mr. and Miss Y, Streets of Rage 4. After Axel, Blaze, and a kid on a skateboard defeated the nefarious Mr. X, Wood Oak City was finally at peace. But in Streets of Rage 4, Axel discovers X's children, Mr. and Miss Y, have inherited their father's fortune, allowing them to forge their own criminal empire. In the final stages, your party will face Mr. Y, who's armed with a machine gun, a bazooka, and an endless supply of explosives. Once you defeat him, you'll move on to the last level where Miss Y challenges you. Although she's extremely fast and her rapier attacks are devastating, you shouldn't have too much trouble with her. But sadly, this pair aren't done with just yet, because after Miss Y is beaten, you'll face the twins again simultaneously. Even though it's tough, you should feel pretty confident in your abilities, knowing that you've bested these two already, right? But just when it looks like you have this brawl in the bag, one of the twins suddenly hops into a giant mecha spider to basically flip over the table. And because of the robot's massive size and sweeping attacks, you'll want to eliminate this machine ASAP. But if you kill the twin piloting the mecha, their sibling then takes over, forcing you to continue battling this robotic monstrosity. Number 8. El Gigante ×2, Resident Evil 4. Due to his monstrous size, astounding strength, and surprising speed, El Gigante is one of Resident Evil 4's most feared enemies. Not only do you have to fight this ogre in narrow arenas, he can break through walls and smash open shelter houses, making it nearly impossible to get away from him. Gigante also absorbs damage like a bloody sponge, so tackling this malformed troll is never easy, even if you're armed to the teeth. And because Gigante is a nightmare to fight, players obviously had a heart attack the first time that they entered the Furnace Arena, where they're confronted with not one, but two of these tyrannical beasts. Fortunately, you don't have to fight both of them. If you pull the lever while a Gigante is in the center, he'll fall into the lava below, meaning that you only have to fight one of these monsters. But if you defeat both Gigantes the old-fashioned way, you'll be rewarded with twice as much money, allowing you to purchase tons of weapon upgrades, which is heavily advised if you're playing on the highest difficulty. Number 7. Vulture and Electro, Spider-Man. Every single boss in Marvel's Spider-Man is superbly innovative. Unfortunately, many of them don't provide that much of a challenge, but the difficulty curve definitely cranks up a notch once you face Vulture and Electro. Although the supervillain's attacks aren't particularly devastating, there's a great many reasons why this bout tests your mettle. Unlike every other boss up until this point, these supervillains can fly, meaning that Spidey has to constantly thwip around to get close to them. They move at incredible speed as well and are constantly on the move, meaning that they can reach your position position in less than a second, regardless of how far away they are. Furthermore, the battle arena is so gigantic that it can be difficult to keep track of them. Although the Vulture and Electro take turns facing you at first, they eventually tag team, making the second half of this confrontation twice as hard. If you haven't perfected your web swing techniques by this point, well, this boss battle is going to be an absolute slog. Number 6. Galeem and Darkon, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. At the end of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate's Adventure Mode, you'll face the Lord of Light Galeem and the embodiment of Chaos Darkon at the same time. By the time that you reach these dual deities, you'll have engaged in hundreds of battles, boosted your skill tree to the max, unlocked dozens of characters, and obtained hundreds of spirits, which you can then equip to embolden your abilities. So you should feel pretty overpowered when you step foot in the final arena. But within seconds, Galeem and Darkon will remind you why they are the true rulers of their own universes. And why are they so hard? Well, you know how difficult it is to fight a boss with screen-filling attacks? Well, now imagine facing two bosses with screen-filling attacks at once. Because these godlings' moves are all-encompassing, you have to spend more time dodging than actually fighting. If you thought that you could kill one god quickly to focus on the other, that just won't work here. If you don't defeat Galeem and Darkon at the same time, you can't unlock the game's true ending. You should applaud yourself if you do actually manage to defeat Galeem and Darkon in single combat. However, only a true Smash player can say that they successfully vanquished both concurrently. Number 5. Theseus and the Minotaur, Hades. Now in Hades, our good lad Zag must navigate through the netherworld so that he can escape to the surface and reunite with his mother Persephone. And as the Big Z is about to leave the Elysium section, he's confronted by Theseus and the Minotaur. And although the sluggish man-bull telegraphs his attacks, you can't risk being hit once since his assaults are absolutely devastating. Despite the fact that you can see his moves coming a mile away, it's still actually tough to avoid since Theseus will be on your ass from beginning to end. And because Theseus has always got his shield up, half of his body is permanently guarded, allowing the Athenian king to absorb your greatest strikes. So it's crucial to take out the Minotaur first, since Theseus' attacks become less predictable once he's at mid-health. Sadly though, you likely haven't seen the end of this duo once you've beat them, and that's because you'll probably have such little health after this brawl, you're sure to meet your doom in the next arena, and when you die, you'll be sent right back to the start, meaning that you'll have to fight Theseus and the Minotaur over and over again. Number 4. Godskins, Elden Ring. Because Elden Ring is regarded as Hidetaka Miyazaki's crown jewel, it's easy to see why it's been lauded with every gaming award imaginable. But since this is a Soulsborne game that we're talking about, it's no surprise that it's really, really freaking hard. Although there are many bosses who will ensure that you become well acquainted with the game over screen, two that stand out are the Godskins. By utilizing his powerful magic, Godskin Noble can decimate your health bar with ease. With his unparalleled speed and lethal rapier, Godskin Apostle can also end you in seconds. As daunting as it is to challenge the Godskins separately, facing them together is a whole other ordeal. Since conventional attacks aren't particularly effective against this couple, you'll have to use your spirit summons to stand a chance. You'll also need an unrealistic level of precision and timing to avoid the ghostly pair pinning you down with their combos. Because you can't risk being exposed for too long, you can only deal a tiny amount of damage to the duo at any time. The worst moment during this fight though is surely the first time that you kill one of the Godskins. With one less target to worry about, you'll probably assume the battle will be twice as easy. Unfortunately though, the deceased Godskin will resurrect itself within moments unless you slay its partner in quick succession. Number 3. The Mantis Lords, Hollow Knight. After arriving in the Mantis village's throne room, the knight's journey will be interrupted by the 3 Mantis Lords. After the gate seals you in, the first lord leaps from her throne and immediately engages you in combat. Each regent attacks by charging at the knight with their lance, hurling their blade across the room like a boomerang or trying to impale you from above. Because the first lord faces you alone, you naturally assume that each of the trio will battle you one by one. By the time that you've eliminated the first boss, you should actually feel pretty confident now that you've memorized the boss's patterns. Only when the remaining 2 lords leap off their thrones in unison does the player realize the last phase is a 2-on-1 battle. Although the remaining 2 lords have less health than their predecessor, this section is 10 times harder. The duo can move so fast you don't even get a single second of rest. Even if you found the first lord a walk in the park, you can easily get killed within seconds if you're not careful in the second half of this battle. Number 2. Wrist and Mist, God of War Ragnarok. At the end of the summoning section of God of War Ragnarok, Odin unleashes two Valkyrie, Rist and Mist, to stop Kratos in his quest. Unlike most boss encounters, the sisters telegraph their attacks with audio cues, not visual ones. When Rist yells sister, Mist launches herself at you, and just before charging at Kratos, Rist will shout yield. If you're not paying attention or don't hear these cues, you won't have time to prepare for these vicious assaults. Once their health bars have been depleted, the Valkyrie will jump into their second phase, with Mist leading the charge this time around. Not only is Mist's spin move a nuisance, the bosses can grab your boy during the phase, forcing you to spend more time protecting your son than actually fighting. And when their health bar hits 0 again, Odin's chosen warriors will initiate the final phase. Not only do they have all the same strategies as before, but Rist and Mist now chuck colossal boulders at you, which are extremely difficult to avoid. So long as you stay on your guard, keep your enemies in your sight and seize every opportunity to strike, you should emerge victorious, but rest assured, these Valkyrie won't make things easy. And number 1, Ornstein and Smough, Dark Souls. Now, being the most infamous duel bosses ever, no one could have topped this list, save for Dark Souls' Dragon Slayer Ornstein and Executioner Smough. This battle is so iconic, it even has its own Wikipedia page. With Ornstein's swift flanking and Smough's brute force, the dreaded twosome strategies perfectly complement one another, making this encounter an utter nightmare. Although you can hide behind the pillars at first, Smough will obliterate them with his sledgehammer, forcing you to face the duo head-on. But that's not all. When Ornstein or Smough perishes, the other absorbs their power, imbuing them with greater reach, strength, and resistance. Oh, and each boss also gets all of their health back. And when this pair kill you, which will definitely happen a lot, you can't have a rematch straight away. To restart this match, you'll have to work your way around Anor Londo all over again, which is needlessly time-consuming. As nerve-shreddingly frustrating as Ornstein and Smough are, there is actually one plus to fighting them, and that is that they are guaranteed to give you the most unforgettable fight of your life. So cheers for that.
Video game bosses have been challenging players for decades. While many bosses are designed to be skill checks to determine if they've grasped the mechanics well enough to progress to the next level, other bosses are meant to push their abilities to the limit. Beating these kinds of rock-solid bosses aren't just a simple achievement, it's a badge of honor that you can boast about to your friends. It requires lightning-fast reflexes, endurance, and high-level gear acquired from hours of grinding to ensure victory. It's not supposed to be easy, and there's no shame in not being able to defeat every video game boss. Bosses like this have frequently cropped up through games for years, with some of the toughest enemies yet appearing in recent games. These are the bosses that drove players to breaking point. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 video game bosses that made us rage quit. 2023 edition. Number 10. Mother Miranda, Resident Evil Village. When Ethan Winters becomes stranded in a village populated with monsters, he finds himself fighting against its group of ghastly leaders so that he can rescue his infant daughter from their diabolical plans. Taking out the village matriarch Mother Miranda, however, will prove to be Ethan's toughest struggle yet. The Resident Evil series has had its fair share of difficult bosses throughout the years, with Jack Krause's second encounter in the Resi 4 remake being just as pesky as it was before. However, avoiding Krause's mutated arms is trivial compared to Miranda's onslaught. Comprised of multiple stages with their own set of powerful attacks, Miranda is able to shroud the entire arena in darkness, dive through the air, and throw fiery orbs at Ethan. It's a long final fight that requires a lot of planning, execution, and learning, but it's Mother Miranda's spider phase that causes the most frustration. Incredibly fast and able to lunge at players, avoiding damage while she's in this phase is almost impossible. It's recommended to deal as much damage at this point as possible to get her out of this phase quickly. Miranda is vexing enough in regular difficulties, but facing her in Village of Shadows mode makes for the hardest boss fight in the entire Resi series. Number 9. Yang the Leader, Sifu. A slick martial arts fighting game, Sifu is a classic tale of revenge that wears its kung fu influences on its sleeve. Not only does this title boast the unique death mechanic which ages the protagonist after each defeat, but Sifu likewise contains some of the best combat in recent games. However, the fast-paced melee is just as uncompromising as it is comprehensive, with boss fights at the end of each of the 5 levels testing the player's skills. While each of these bosses puts up their own imposing challenge, it's Yang the Leader who proves to be this game's ultimate test. Living up to the expectation of a final boss in a game that's already been hard as nails, Yang is particularly strong and nimble and is able to hit you hard and fast. The wide range of combos at his disposal likewise makes learning his attacks harder than any of the other bosses, but it's the player's inability to use their focus meter which puts this boss on this list. Without the ability to slow down time to make this fight easier, defeating Yang requires players to prove they've mastered the fundamentals of attacking and dodging if they want to beat the game. Number 8. Blindfolded Boy, Wolong Fallen Dynasty. Putting their own spin on Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, the gameplay of Team Ninja's Wolong Fallen Dynasty puts a focus on deflecting enemy attacks to break their stamina meter. By throwing in some of their own tweaks to the formula, the Nioh 2 developers created a Souls-like that has an intricate and satisfying combat system. Putting players' parrying and dodging skills to the test is a roster of powerful bosses that are a tough fight even for the most seasoned Soulsborne player. The boss which will give players the biggest headache though is Blindfolded Boy. Like any Souls-like baddie worth their salt, beating Wolong's final boss means that players need to utilize everything they've learned in the game up to this point. Learning the timings to counter his attacks and then ensuring you evade those unblockable moves is the key to success. However, making this fight even trickier is Blindfolded Boy's love for launching hails of daggers at players as curveballs between combos in order to knock them off their stride. Even after gaining a solid grasp on his attacks, his mammoth health bar makes this showdown a nail-biting battle of attrition where every blow counts. Number 7. Nemesis, Returnal. With its fast-paced and frantic combat time loop action game, Returnal proved to be one of the hardest games of 2021. The hectic bullet hell action on screen meant players would need to stay alert if they aimed to make it to the end of a challenging run. One boss which was more likely to lower those chances was the aptly named Nemesis, who's fought at the top of the derelict citadel during the game's 3rd level. A floating alien mass flanked by groups of allies, this boss wastes no time in covering the screen with a dizzying array of projectiles, each variety of which possesses its own speed and trajectory. Weaving between these orbs is already a palm-sweating challenge, but Nemesis lives up to their name by having their accomplices fire broad lasers across the arena too. The introduction of floating platforms in the following phases only ramps up the battle's intensity, as players now need to grapple across them to get closer to Nemesis, once again avoiding those projectiles and lasers. Moreover, the boss can teleport during the second phase of the fight, meaning players will need to stay on the move. At least this particular fight is a gorgeous visual spectacle, which is a good thing because you're probably going to be seeing it a lot. Number 6. Chef Salt Baker, Cuphead The Delicious Last Course. Originally releasing in 2017, Cuphead served up some frantic bullet hell boss fights that were as fiendishly difficult as they were bursting with charm and style. 5 years later, developer studio MDHR returned with more 2D action with their Delicious Last Course DLC. Though short in length, this expansion nevertheless included some of the game's most diabolically challenging and sadistic bosses. Out of the 6 colorfully animated villains that players will find themselves facing up against, it's the final boss who proves to be the most unforgivingly intense. This boss was Chef Salt Baker, the kind-hearted baker who agreed to create the Wonder Tart for Cuphead and his friends at the start of the DLC. In addition to peppering the screen full of projectiles to keep players constantly on the move whilst paying attention to what's happening, a large part of the difficulty of this fight is just how long it is. Taking up a whopping 4 different phases, it takes a lot of concentration and determination to make it to the end. However, after the final platforming section of this arduous showdown, players will have earned the satisfaction of beating the hardest boss in the entire game. Number 5. The Heir, Tunic. While the adorably colorful Tunic may look like a lighthearted, isometric adventure that pays homage to the Zeldas of old, underneath this cutesy surface is an unforgiving experience that refuses to give players any guidance. In a game this demanding, it shouldn't be surprising that the bosses found within Tunic's serene game world are comparable to anything you'd find in a FromSoft game, one in particular being the Heir. The benevolent spirit who helps the fox protagonist throughout their adventure. Fighting this boss is optional if players opt for a different ending. But if players do decide to fight, they'll be in for a rough time. Likewise, while players can commence the fight at the end of the game, it's recommended they take the time to restore their upgrades by visiting the heroes' graves to make the battle more manageable. The Heir will attack immediately after entering the arena, bombarding players with their powerful melee and magic attacks. Making the fight even harder is that this is the only boss in the game to have a second phase. Here, longer combos and a health-draining attack that's brand new and something else you're gonna have to deal with add to the already insane difficulty. Number 4. Hades, Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection. When it comes to controller-breaking levels of difficulty, it doesn't come much more infuriating than the Ghosts and Goblins series. A 2D platformer littered with respawning enemies, storms of projectiles, and cruel traps, the original NES game's notorious difficulty has since become legendary, with the rest of the series continuing to revel in this sadistic challenge. The latest of which was 2021's Resurrection. Although Capcom introduced different difficulty modes to make the title more approachable, this game can still be masochistically brutal to whoever dares try. The pinnacle of Capcom's cruelty came in the form of the game's secret boss, Hades. To unlock the true ending of the game and face Hades, players will first need to beat every level of the game, including their shadow variations, alongside finding and completing every hidden area. Getting to this boss is already a mighty undertaking, but it's nothing compared to the fight itself. Players will need to constantly dodge the boss's constant barrage of laser projectiles and lightning bolts while they attempt to chip away at his health. Making things even tougher, this boss tilts the small platform and even spits black holes. With only a few hits to be sustained until it's game over, if you want to beat Hades, you're gonna need unwavering nerves of steel. Number 3. Gnar Valkyrie Queen, God of War Ragnarok. One of the highly anticipated and acclaimed games of 2022, God of War Ragnarok once again put players in the battle-weary shoes of Kratos for another character-driven action epic. Much like the previous game, the narrative was emotionally captivating, the presentation was cinematically epic, and the action was satisfyingly visceral, offering up a selection of challenging boss fights throughout the game. None of these fights would be as deadly, however, as that with Gnar the Valkyrie Queen. By far the most difficult boss in the game, the leader of Odin's forces is a fight that's only unlocked after completing the game. Once players first encounter her in the Crucible, they'll be warned that they should only attack when they think they're ready. This warning should not be taken lightly. Incredibly aggressive and possessing an unpredictable moveset, players will need to stay on their toes if they mean to avoid Gnar's brutal combos and unblockable attacks. Dealing massive amounts of damage at a time, one misstep could result in a quick defeat. Even with fully leveled weapons and armor, if you want to be able to take this chick out, you're going to need an unbelievable mastery of the game's combat and abilities. Number 2. Vice the Immaculate, Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade. Included as an extra boss fight in the PS5 version of Final Fantasy VII Remake, Vice the Immaculate is a super boss who's by far one of the most demanding and punishing foes that players will face in the entirety of the game. Originally appearing in Dirge of Cerberus, this foe makes their return in the combat simulator in Chapter 17, after completing the Yuffie-focused DLC. Unsuspecting players will immediately be overwhelmed by Vice's incredible speed and aggression as he zips between your party members with incredible combos. He'll likewise mimic abilities from 2 other bosses from Dirge of Cerberus, and if players are unable to end a stage of his fight fast enough, he'll unleash the devastating and aptly named move Immaculate End to deal an eye-watering 9,999 damage to each party member. Moreover, with Vice being incredibly difficult to damage and counter, alongside only being accessible in hard mode, this fight will appear to be impossible to win after he effortlessly slices through the whole party in seconds flat. But there is a strategy to beating Vice, and it revolves around getting the party's stagger as high as possible. With determination and patience, players can unlock the Corruptor of the Immaculate trophy.
The most satisfying gaming moment often comes when you triumph over an exceptionally difficult boss. Naturally then, the harder your opponent is, the more satisfaction that you feel after you win. But there are some times that developers have gone too far with this idea, creating bosses that are pretty much invincible. With that in mind, then, I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video game bosses that are almost impossible to beat. Number 10, Through the Fire and Flames, Guitar Hero 3. There is no question that Through the Fire and Flames is the hardest section in Guitar Hero 3 Legends of Rock. It's just so difficult to perform that most players can't even complete the first 5% of Dragon Force's iconic melody. Hell, music legends like Jimi Hendrix and Slash would balk at the requirements needed to play even a fraction of this 7-minute tune. Through the Fire and Flames contains a preposterous 3,722 notes, meaning you have to hit 26.6 notes per second. And they come at you so quick that your brain can barely have time to process them, nor can your fingers deal with that much multitasking. There are so many green notes in the intro especially that many players just rely on placing a rubber band around the green button to get past this segment. Some might rope a friend in to press the green button accordingly while the player focuses on hitting the other notes, and you know a boss is unfair when it inspires players to devise elaborate methods to cheat. Even though there have been many rock-hard rock songs in the sequels, Through the Fire and Flames is still the toughest of the lot. Number 9, Mama Back Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. Because the Dead Ops arcade maps were so popular in COD Black Ops, it was no surprise when the feature returned in Black Ops Cold War. However, players were surprised to learn the campaign this time centered around their squad facing a bespectacled gorilla called Mama Back. Even though it sounds like a joke, few players have managed to actually reach this boss, not to mention actually defeat her. And that's because this campaign requires players to work through a whopping 64 rounds, which already takes around 3 to 4 hours. Then there's Mama Back herself. Not only is this tyrannical ape astoundingly fast and brutal, but she picks up any treasure, weapons, and items nearby, robbing you of the very resources that you need to actually defeat her. And although only a handful have actually reached this boss, even fewer have gone any further. And unfortunately, you only receive the trophy for this challenge if you complete all 64 rounds and beat Mama Back in one go. Unsurprisingly, barely anyone has claimed this trophy thanks to that darned gorilla. Number 7, The Fume Knight Dark Souls 2. According to stats collected by From Software, 4 of the 5 hardest bosses in Dark Souls 2 can be found in the DLC Crown of the Old Iron King. And even though many struggled with the Squalid Queen and the Slumbering Dragon, players had the most difficulty with the Fume Knight. This towering warrior boasts an absolutely nightmarish 93% failure rate, which is higher than any other enemy in the game. Even though you'll be instinctively cautious of the knight's gargantuan blade, you actually have to watch out for his longsword, since he can lunge at you with it from any angle. Unfortunately, any dodging or blocking strategy goes out the window when the Fume Knight imbues his greatsword with magic. With his enchanted blade, the malevolent warrior can break through your shielding without basically any effort and just decimate your health bar. So if you were disappointed that this sequel's difficulty didn't match its reputation, then this guy will absolutely set things straight. Number 6, Absolute Radiance Hollow Knight's Godmaster mode. As difficult as Hollow Knight is, its Godmaster DLC is absolutely something else. Even if you think you're a pro at this Metroidvania title, you'll be shaking in your boots after going one round against the final boss of this add-on, Absolute Radiance. Essentially a beefed up version of the already stupidly difficult secret final boss in the main game, only the most hardcore of hardcore players will be able to take this being on. Blasting the player with an array of swords, walls of light, and destructive orbs. While you do your best to dodge these projectiles, you have to keep an eye on where you step, since Absolute Radiance can summon spikes from the floor at any given moment. Like all hated bosses, there are multiple stages to fighting this deity, and with every succeeding phase, Radiance moves more sporadically and churns out projectiles even more fervently than a previous counterpart. You'll definitely spend sections of the brawl not even trying to hit this boss because you'll be too busy avoiding their barrage of attacks. Worse still, there are less platforms to land on as the battle progresses, which means you have to think about platforming while you're trying to deal damage. Absolute Radiance is the toughest kind of enemy because you only need to make one mistake to pop your clogs. Number 5, Cthulhu World of Warcraft. When World of Warcraft players first encountered Cthulhu, they were blown away by the old god's outrageous difficulty. No matter how intricate and strategic groups were in their raids, they just couldn't fell the Lovecraftian creature. And over time, it became clear that this boss wasn't just difficult, he was actually, without a shred of exaggeration, genuinely undefeatable. Even though the phrase impossible boss is thrown around all too often, including in this list perhaps, this bulbous monstrosity definitely fits the bill to a T. Simply put, there isn't enough time for any raid to destroy this guy's tentacles before the Cthulhu-inspired beast wipes them out. And since mana is incredibly limited, players have no effective means to regenerate lost health. Also, there was a glitch at one point that Cthulhu could hit players with his tentacles even after he devoured them, causing them to suffer far more damage than they should have received. After Blizzard received complaints for months over this issue, they finally patched WoW so the boss's defeat was more feasible. And wouldn't you know it, mere hours after this patch went through, a guild destroyed the infernal boss for the first time, allowing the WoW community to believe a collective sigh of relief. Number 3, Absolute Virtue of Final Fantasy XI. Being an MMORPG, there are intervals in Final Fantasy XI where you can take part in raid bosses, meaning, as we've established, you can partner up with other players to fight a super powerful enemy. But if you intend to battle Absolute Virtue, you better cancel your plans for the next day or two, and that's not an exaggeration either. In fact, some raiders spent over 30 hours fighting this notorious monster, and they still couldn't beat him. When the developers noticed that a grand total of 0 people had defeated Absolute Virtue in 3 years, they finally decided to nerf the Godling's power. Even in his lesser state though, Virtue is still a nightmare to face. Once his health gets down to 59%, he summons twice as many wyverns and boosts all of his stats, making the second half of the fight somehow 10 times harder. And even worse, just when you think you're getting somewhere, Virtue performs a benediction, which restores half of his health. And this just makes the last hour or two that you might have spent coordinating your attacks just completely pointless. Since Absolute Virtue can perform this enchantment multiple times as well, you can understand why so few gamers have actually beaten him, even after his difficulty was toned down. Number 1, Queen Larsa Bug Princess Duo. Bullet hell shooters are regarded as one of the hardest genres in gaming, since, as the name suggests, the screen is regularly filled with hundreds of enemy projectiles which your character must avoid. However, no game in this genre comes quite close to matching the difficulty of Bug Princess Duo. As hard as the game is, the skill required to vanquish the antagonist, Queen Larsa, is pretty much unprecedented. Throughout the fight, the deranged regent unleashes hundreds of lethal lasers in every direction at any one time. Although it's a pretty uncreative tactic, the reason why it's so devastating is because Larsa never lets up. There isn't a single moment where the screen isn't littered with deadly projectiles, and never in the history of gaming has the player had to watch out for so many obstacles at once. Hell, it gets so overwhelming for most gamers that your eyes just can't focus on where you even are, which will result in your immediate death. Because the Queen literally launches millions of lasers at you, you might think this battle is genuinely unbeatable. And while that's not true, it is very, 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 very hard.
Now, some video game bosses are purposefully designed to be very, very beatable, and they tend to be the ones that allow us to actually progress through a game's story, but others deliberately pose a real challenge. Maybe they test our wits, our perseverance, and with ever-improving AI, our strategies, but ultimately we were rewarded with a feeling of pure elation when we finally beat them. But then there are these guys, who are just there, well, let's face it, to frustrate you. Sure, the developers entice us with a dangling carrot of maybe a rare item, a super weapon, or a hidden playable character, but sometimes the sheer effort to overcome these optional challenges is just not bloody worth it. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 insanely difficult video game bosses that weren't worth the pain. Number 10, Sephiroth, Kingdom Hearts. Now, when Sephiroth surprised us all as the platinum matchup inside the Olympus Coliseum in Kingdom Hearts, our excitement at hearing his award-winning theme music quickly dissipated after we struck him several times, only to realize that his HP was so high that we were well in over our heads. And it's not even his HP that's the real problem. It might take a while to whittle him down, but that's going to be fine so long as we have space and time to do it. Oh, I'm dead. Oh, I'm dead. Sephiroth's damage is brutal, constantly requiring us to run away and heal ourselves before we try again, only to get hit and then have to start fleeing once more. Now, even that may be sort of acceptable, except the arena that you fight him in is only slightly larger than Sephiroth's Masamune blade in the first bloody place. Huge amounts of health, high attack, and being almost impossible to dodge, that is utterly nightmarish. And what's the reward for all of this? A bronze trophy. Right, okay, bye. Number 9, Sir Corthrian, Dragon Age Origins. Now, during the fight at the Isle of Denerim's estate, Sir Corthrian is slow but supremely strong. Her hits don't just do massive amounts of damage, but knock you back as well, making recovery slow and defense almost non-existent. However, what makes this fight even more difficult is her entourage of archers, which just fire away at you at all sides, stunning you and your allies with seemingly every arrow. In truth, the only real way to win this battle is to have high enough stamina and HP to survive the initial onslaught, meaning that you need to be at least level 19 and just hope that she and her lackeys kill all of your teammates before they get their hands on you. If you're lucky, you'll only be stunned once or twice while running into one of the adjacent rooms. This allows you to fight her away from the rain of arrows, giving you breathing room to defend and attack as you normally would. Honestly though, unless you're super determined, just surrender or die when you encounter this battle. It's not worth the heartache, because it's the only battle in the game where where you're allowed to lose without a game over anyway, and all you get for winning is her crappy sword. Number 7. Lingering Will, Kingdom Hearts 2. As frustratingly difficult as Sephiroth was in Kingdom Hearts, his return in the sequel wasn't as controller-smashingly infuriating. Instead, that most despised of all awards went to Lingering Will, the manifestation of Terra's essence and Keyblade armor. His quick speed and flying attacks are difficult to dodge, but once you get the timing right, you can kinda predict where he'll land and get a few hits in. However, he'll then mix up his strong attacks with a whip that is completely unpredictable and a gliding Keyblade that will move him around the map faster than you can handle. It's all survivable, however, given some good dodging skills, until that is his health starts to get low and he breaks out his ultimate attacks. The first is just about blockable, while the second requires running away as quickly as you can until he expends himself. If he hits you, you are dead. Just as with the third part of this explosive attack, your guard, dodge, rolling, and quick run skills have to be timed down to the millisecond, or it's a game over. Number 6. Magician Faust, The Legend of Dragoon. In JRPGs, oftentimes you can't fight any super hard boss without first locating numerous hidden items. In the case of The Legend of Dragoon, that's 50 Stardust stones from around the world. This then allows you to acquire the Vanishing Stone and then attempt to navigate the tricky teleport maze beneath the Flanvel Tower. And that is the easy part, my friend. Magician Faust immediately makes his power known by casting a fire-based attack that will almost certainly kill the entire party except for Dart, and even here he'll need his red Dragoon armor. Faust is virtually impervious to magical attacks and is himself capable of doing extremely powerful attacks that almost always have a high chance of killing everyone in the party. As frustrating as he can be, equipping your entire team with their Dragoon armors will help negate much of the damage that he tries to do. Also, defeating him unlocks the supremely brilliant Phantom Shield and a huge mound of gold, making him one of the few optional bosses on this list with a decent reward, but it's still not worth the time and effort put into finding him and preparing for the battle in the first bloody place. Number 5. Night Terror, Soul Calibur 3. Just getting to Night Terror, the secret ultimate form of antagonist nightmare, can be a challenge in itself, and one few players found without following guides. To unlock this boss, you'll need to have completed the Tales of Soul story following specific choices for each player, which is not so difficult when you have the guide, though winning every single round could prove to be too great a challenge for many. Unfortunately, that's not even the hard part, because once you finally get to Night Terror, it turns out that he more than lives up to his name, haunting your dreams for years to come with the hundreds and hundreds of times that he will decimate you. Now don't let his huge size fool you. He's quick, he's powerful, and uses lasers for long-range attacks. He also flies, which not only allows him to jump out of your reach just when you're stringing together a particularly effective attack, but also when you try to force him out of the ring like you do with most other enemies, he simply flies back in. Oh great. Number 4. Father Rodin, Bayonetta. So if you're mad enough to take the time to harvest over 10 million Halos, that is right, 10 million, and buy the platinum ticket in Bayonetta from ally and weapon seller Father Rodin, he rewards you by revealing his true winged form and then summarily tries to utterly obliterate you. Now he goes one better than many other optional bosses on this list by not only having high HP and exceptional defense, but he also is invulnerable to being stunned, and which time does nothing, and worst of all, if you do manage to find a dent in his armor and start to damage him, he gets a power boost as the fight goes on. But worse than all of this is that he has his own version of Bayonetta's Wicked Weave attack, capable of reducing you down to almost 0 HP. That's fine, you say, reaching for your health items to get you back in the battle, only to feel that cold sweat of panic when you can't actually use them. Yes, that's right, sorry, no recovery items are allowed in this battle. Oh gee. Number 3. Nancy MI847J, Tekken 6. Oh dear lord. Now I'm sure that there are some beat-em-up savants that are listening to this that barely batted an eyelid whilst fighting this robotic monstrosity, but for many a gamer, this was too much. No doubt created to top the challenge of Soul Calibur 3's Night Terror, Tekken 6 introduced this optional boss before the main story bad guys. So first, let's get the good news out of the way. Nancy doesn't block any attacks here. But that's it. That's all of the good news. That is all of the good news that you are getting. This mechanical giant is so large that it takes up most of the screen, making it incredibly difficult to get away from. Frustrating, as you can imagine, because you'll need to put some distance between it and you. Its attacks are hugely powerful. It has high defense, because after all you are punching reinforced metal, and it has a health bar 10 times as long as the other Tekken characters. Plus, it has lasers which it uses to shoot out the glass floor, and if you fall through that, it's an instant death. So yeah, have fun. Number 2, The Demi-Fiend, Shin Megami Tensei Digital Devil Saga. Now, Demi-Fiend's surprise return from Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne has not only gotten stronger, but is way more annoying. His attacks don't just nearly kill all of you, even with completely maxed out stats, but they also inflict you with crippling status effects as well. Only these are slightly different because they can't be countered by Void. In fact, if you enter the battle equipped with anything that reflects or absorbs any element, Demi-Fiend kills you in one hit. Worse than all of this, though, is his infuriatingly strong Gaia Rage, which in a game with a HP cap of 999 does 7,000 damage. Unlike any other optional bosses out there, you can only win this battle with a little luck on your side. The way to survive this is to equip Null Sleep, and then hope that one of Demi-Fiend's minions casts Sleep on a character at the right moment, and that character then doesn't receive damage from the Mega Gaia Rage attack whilst asleep. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, there's one more thing as well. His minions not only constantly negate the effects that you cast on him, but also enjoy healing him to full health from time to time as well. Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much.
For a while, the very idea of a boss battle felt like it belonged to a bygone age, an era of video game mascots, snappier arcade-style gameplay, and games that didn't just end on plot revelations or story beats. All those conversations about the gaming industry maturing out of these tropes were interesting, but as something like the Soul genre went on to prove, they sidestepped just how much fun and how memorable a final boss fight can be. Therein lies the challenge though, as for a final boss, they need to represent the culmination of everything you've learned and prepared for, confronting you in a way nothing else has to make sure you earn those final credits. Some developers, though, do it better than others. I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and these are 9 final video game bosses that required incredible skill. Also, a quick newer game spoiler note for Final Fantasy VII Remake, Hades, and Death's Door. Number 9, Shao Kahn, Mortal Kombat 2011. Any fighting game boss worth their salt needs to absolutely demolish the player in a few seconds just to establish that they mean business. 2011 Shao Kahn then was an absolute nightmare to fight, coming after a phenomenally innovative campaign where Ed Boon and NetherRealm designed the first fighting game story where bouts loaded in the background. The story confidently reapproached locations and characters from decades prior, and honestly, it's one of my personal favorites. Because of this relatively easy ramp up though, the fact Shao Kahn was damn near broken, spamming unblockable attacks, tanking hits, juggling you all the time and taunting afterwards made him infuriating. Defeating Kahn came down to memorizing everything he could throw at you, down to specific animation frames so you'd know when to actually start a string of moves. Noting which of your own attacks could be spammed and which might stunlock him into giving you the upper hand was paramount. To this day, I don't know anyone who fought Shao Kahn fairly, instead lowering themselves to his level just to make it through. Number 8, the Ender Dragon, Minecraft. The vast majority of Minecraft players won't do anything other than live a lovely, mostly carefree life of house building, resource gathering, ore mining, and whatever other idyllic frivolities come to mind. They'll also be scared half to death in the middle of an in-game night by a witch or have their living room decimated by a creeper, but that's by the by. Point is, Minecraft does have an overall progression and final boss, it's just hidden underneath everything else. Reaching the Ender Dragon is tied to crafting the best armor and weapons, then finding an Eye of Ender Pearl to face the beast in another realm entirely. Thankfully, the dragon itself isn't very hard to fight, but the sheer amount of stuff you have to do makes reaching it a hefty challenge. Also, although it's hard to do after so much preparation, dying to this thing sees you fall into the void and lose things like diamond armor and various other rare items. To date, only 6% of Minecraft players on PlayStation have faced and defeated the Ender Dragon. Number 7, Seth, Street Fighter IV. Another from the fighting game school of let's give this guy as many cheap moves as possible to manufacture challenge, even veteran Street Fighter players, of which there are millions, recommend turning the rounds down so you only have to beat Seth once. Sadly, even accomplishing that is a Herculean task, as Seth comes at you with teleports to interrupt your attacks, unblockable grapples, and screen-wide sweeps that'll catch you even attempting to land a blow. Kinda like Shao Kahn, it becomes a game of seeing which of your moves you can spam to win, or you can dive into the settings even more to reduce round time to 30 seconds. In short, you can tell exactly what Capcom were going for here, and after Street Fighter 3's Gil, it's no surprise, but what lay under Street Fighter 4's welcoming inky art style was a final arcade bout of pure pain. Number 6, Lou, Guitar Hero 3, Legends of Rock. The Guitar Hero / plastic guitar craze of the late 2000s was one hell of a thing. A super lucrative trend that eventually destroyed itself with too many peripherals and spin-offs. Even Guitar Hero and Rock Band themselves couldn't bring it back in 2015. Arguably the best of the bunch then, not counting how stellar Rock Band's DLC offerings were, was Guitar Hero 3. A title that had you go up against literal legends of rock like Guns N' Roses Slash and Rage Against the Machine / Audioslave's Tom Morello. For the final duel though, Neversoft put you up against the devil himself, Lou. Playing Charlie Daniels' The Devil Went Down to Georgia, covered and made twice as hard by Stephen Ouimet. Needless to say, this was already a complex song, but even on easy it could give you a hard time during those escalating solos. On medium, hard, and especially expert, Devil Went Down to Georgia turns into the hardest song in the game this side of Dragon Forces Through Fire and Flames. Number 5. Hades. From Hades. The immaculate Hades is a must-play, a game that amazingly tells a meaningful story with great characters, intrigue, subversion, and payoff around the structure of a roguelike. By the time you reach Hades himself and are ready to leave the confines of hell, you'll likely have died countless amounts of times, interacted with various bosses who can go on to become your friends, and you'll have unlocked tons of weapon abilities and tactics to see you through. Still, Hades himself is an obscenely tough boss to fight. The game overall has a really solid challenge throughout, but not only are you going back to the beginning if you lose, but Hades' attacks give you very little safe room. In between the crisscrossing lasers, summoned enemies, radial pulses, and projectiles is Hades coming directly for you. Shoulder barges, circular sweeps, he can even become a ball of rotating pure energy that will catch you at some point. Hades the game is tough, but Hades the god is brutal. Number 4. Senator Armstrong. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Platinum Games' take on Metal Gear lore and Hideo Kojima's sci storytelling saw them lampoon and pay tribute to the franchise and its creator in equal measure. For every badass mech duel or sword fight, there was a 30-minute monologue about politics and philosophy, eventually building to a showdown against Senator Armstrong. As the big bad of the whole game with nanomachine-powered skin no less, this fight lasts a full half hour, comprising multiple stages, a spider mech, and a mutated Armstrong really going after you. The epitome of Rise's dodge and parry-heavy gameplay, every last input from you must be spot on. Senator Armstrong can lock you into high damage dealing grapples, and even his basic melee slams take huge chunks out of your life bar. The fight is checkpointed, but that whole final stretch, well, you'll have to do that without any restarts. Number 3. The Lord of Doors. Death's Door. The inspiration behind this list, and a being that is such a tedious individual to fight, Acid Nerve's Death's Door almost turns into Cuphead for its final bout. It's very satisfying puzzle and combat-wise, and all 4 prior bosses are fun to pick apart and defeat. The Lord of Doors, though, crunches all those timing windows down to milliseconds. Now you need to dodge at exactly the right time or get obliterated. The fight comprising multiple stages where the screen itself gets cluttered with obtrusive lasers and summoned enemies come at you from both sides. Even the Lord's health pool is notably bigger than any other boss, meaning you have to stay in that anxiety-riddled state of everything kicking off for a good chunk of time before he finally goes down. Number 2. Sephiroth on hard mode. Final Fantasy VII Remake. Final Fantasy VII's Remake gets a ton right and a ton wrong, depending on who you ask. Its hard mode, though, is one of the best around, actually upending the very way you play and plan fights, making it so your MP can't be regained until in between chapters, and upping health pools of enemies, AI aggression, etc. puts a premium on your biggest moves and spells. It means melee exchanges, item use, and status effects have to happen more frequently, and you really need to think about character loadouts and specific tactics in battle at every turn. In short, it's closer to the original Final Fantasy VII, and like that game too, your true test of everything is when Sephiroth enters the fold. Coming in multiple stages as teammates gradually return to battle, the real stickler with this final elongated fight is how much you need to juggle parries and elemental defense while doling out enough damage to kill him before he auto-wins at the very end. Yes, Sephiroth summons a big ol' meteor and then counts down until he wins. If your approach wasn't perfect this whole time, he'll still have too much health during this final phase and you'll lose anyway. Hard mode is genuinely the way to play this game, but this ending fight is ludicrously tough. And number 1, Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. Talk about getting lucky with an at the time relatively unknown fighter who you just signed to a boxing game arriving in the near future. Turns out Mike Tyson was offered a measly $50,000 to appear in the original Punch-Out, the whole thing then working brilliantly in Nintendo's favor straight after. Overnight and backed by solid gameplay, Punch-Out became the game where you could try and fight the undefeated champ himself. Obviously, this being 80s arcade difficulty and the apex of the Nintendo hard period, Tyson came with instant knockouts for the first minute and a half of the fight, requiring perfect performance on your part to even make a dent. We're talking dodges of a handful of frames or less and the ultimate punishment if you're defeated. In-game Mike Tyson is the crystallized form of video game difficulty, an unrelentingly precise challenge that only the most dedicated players will ever surmount.